Welcome, dear listener, to another long and quiet journey into the forgotten corners of history. Tonight, as you prepare to drift slowly into sleep, we will travel together to the distant past, to the ancient land of Mesopotamia, where myths of gods and kings were carved upon clay tablets, and where stories whispered through the centuries about beings called the Anunnaki. These mysterious figures, half divine and half legendary, lived in the memory of Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians. This episode is not meant to dazzle you with drama or loud excitement. Instead, it is made to lull you into calm, to let your mind wander among quiet ruins and silent stars, until the details of history blend softly into dreams. Before we begin, I invite you, as always, to take a moment, breathe deeply, and make yourself comfortable. If you have not yet subscribed to Whispers of History and Myth, now is the perfect time. Subscribing ensures you never miss another quiet tale from the dusty scrolls of human memory. And now, let us begin. Let us follow the slow and gentle echoes of the Anunnaki. If fields wrote poems in furrows and temples and steps, memory wrote itself on clay and sky, durable pages that asked only for patience. Mesopotamia learned early that the gentlest revolution is a habit kept, a scale balanced, a gate opened and closed on time, a lamp trimmed so its smoke will not sting a tired eye. The Anunnaki, whose names have moved like steady lanterns through these stories, lived most surely in that thread, the long, quiet strand that ties one good act to the next. In the scribal rooms, tablets slept in jars, cool, upright, wrapped sometimes in scrap cloth to keep edges from chipping. Each jar held a neighborhood, contracts that shook hands across seasons, hymn lists that stitched festivals into the year, inventories that made sure tools would be where hands remembered. A scribe copied a fading text, not because anyone shouted for it, but because that is what cities do when they love their own continuity. The stylus pressed, lifted, pressed again. The line ended. The tablet turned. Breath stayed steady. If you listened, you could hear the whole city breathing with the scribe, kitchens, workshops, courts, fields, each at its own rhythm, all agreeing on sequence. The sky above kept the larger ledger. Priests marked the moon's shy returns, the planet's deliberate wanderings, the fixed lights that drifted only in the patient way that teaches generations the value of waiting. A note: Venus absent these many nights, reappears near dawn. Another: eclipse half eaten, ended early. Barley fair next month. No prophecy barked. No thunder boasted. The entries were polite guesses seasoned by long memory. When the guess matched the season, satisfaction moved through the temple like a warm draft. When it didn't, a priest smiled and wrote, "So, not this," and kept writing. The Anunnaki were credited not with making the world predictable, but with making it readable. The city gates. Elders repeated the ordinary miracles. A scale met itself. A measure poured true. A traveler's letter arrived with the seal unbroken. A debt forgiven on the right festival day. Children learned to spot the lilt in such things. That is how justice sounds, a grandfather said as a judge's hand rested flat on a tablet to finish the line. That is how fairness looks, a mother said as water lifted to one garden, then another in their turns. A city's character is the sum of its courtesies. The Anunnaki's character, as the people read it, was courtesy writ large. Stories became furniture, always there, always useful. The long flood was a bench sturdy enough to sit many reminders at once. Make the boat before the rain. Treat lists as life preservers. Consider the reed wall a friend. The descent below was a low shelf near the door. Put down what is not needed. Take along what helps you greet gatekeepers. Bow to ledgers that balance. The creation of men from clay and blood was a table that never wobbled when set on honest floor. We are made for work shared and rest deserved. The Anunnaki did not wrestle the world into goodness. They taught it to hold good shape. In the workshops, knowledge walked arm in arm with repair. A smith reheated, rearmored, rewetted handles to blades. A potter reslipped a jar whose lip had roughened. A weaver unpicked 6 inches and wove them again without drama. A builder returned to a step to shave the rise so knees would bless him for years. When something failed loudly, neighbors gathered with quiet tools. When something held longer than anyone expected, someone rubbed a finger along the edge and said, "Whoever made this wanted me to rest today." The Anunnaki were thanked in those rubs and nods. Gods who love order love neighborhoods that repair without spectacle. Festivals came, bright but measured. The statue rode through streets both familiar and improved. Children held figs that stained their fingers with sweetness. Old men in cool doorways hummed meters the priests would make formal at dusk. The city's year turned like a water wheel that no hand need push because the canal was kept clean. A visiting merchant learned the names of the gods by the way the market moved. The Anunnaki's assembly, invoked in lists that soothed like counting beads, was felt as a permission slip. You may trust today. It is arranged. At home, the quiet laws held. A door's latch found its catch with a sound everyone loved. A roof learned the new rain and forgot the old leak. A bed met shoulders and did not brag. The smallest shrine niche accepted crumbs and drops and the kind of thank you that sounds like a list of tomorrow's chores. Memory does not need gold. It needs returning. The Anunnaki's names, repeated lightly at the lamp, were not thunderclaps, just handles for breath. The dead stayed near and far at once, close in stories, in the way a word is close when you say it. Distant in the way dust is distant, beneath your feet, under all. Kisbu was kept, a loaf, a cup, a little water. A measured offering on a measured night. Tares found their bowl and did not overflow the room because the room had rules about how to hold things. The assembly below tallied kindness like grain. The assembly above tallied days like stars. The assemblies in between, courts, guilds, households, copied those ledgers in their smaller ways. The city, altogether, became the scribe of its own patience. Sometimes a new thing arrived, a tune from the north with a turn that surprised the mouth. A stitch taught by a cousin of a cousin. A strain of seed that liked a slightly different furrow. A law that forgave a class of debts smarter and earlier than last time. The city made a place for the new by doing the old slightly better, rehearsing the habit of hospitality until novelty could sit without bumping elbows. The Anunnaki, who had seen many beginnings, were imagined approving innovations that learned the grammar of the place they entered night. When the brick had returned its heat to the air and cats walked the borders of roofs like punctuation, the whole became soft enough to sleep in. A priest had finished his hymn. A judge had closed his case. A warden had pushed the last reed back into a gate. A brewer had set a lid upon a vat. A mother had counted a child's breaths to a number that satisfied both of them. The Anunnaki were invoked once more, not with fear or bargaining, but with the tone of final alignment, a last shelf adjusted. A last wick trimmed, you could hold a city's soul in 3 gestures, straightening the scale's tongue. Drawing a line in damp clay without wobble. Placing a lamp where it will give light and not be knocked. Do those, and the rest will want to behave. That was the old confidence. Humble, dignified, tested. It does not shine like bronze. It glows like bread that if you lean your head now into your own pillow as if into a palm that knows you, you are reenacting their best theology. Close your door gently. Check your inner gate. What water to let through, what to hold. Make a little list, not to bind the morning, but to welcome it. Let the names of whatever you call your assemblies, family, friends, neighbors, crafts, pass in review without hurry. You have walked a long loop with the Anunnaki this night, from clay to star, from market to shrine, from birth to underworld and back to the threshold of sleep. The ledger balances. The lamp stands upright. The seal takes a clean impression in the soft margin of the day. You may rest. In the very earliest chapters of human civilization, there lay a fertile plain, nestled between the 2 mighty rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This was the land that would later be called Mesopotamia, a name meaning simply the land between rivers. Yet to those who lived there thousands of years ago, it was not just soil and water, it was the cradle of agriculture, the birthplace of writing, and the stage upon which the earliest stories of gods and kings were performed. It is here that we first encounter the Anunnaki. To the Sumerians, who built the first great cities around 3000 BCE, The world was filled with divine presence. The skies, the rivers, the earth, and the stars, all had voices, and all were woven into a grand pattern of order and mystery. Their temples, called ziggurats, rose like mountains in flat landscapes, reaching upward toward heaven, as if to remind humanity of the eternal connection between earth and the realm of the gods. The Anunnaki were thought of not as distant, unknowable beings, but as active participants in the rhythm of life. They were described as a great assembly of deities, the children of the sky god Anu, who presided over the heavens. Some stories place them as judges in the underworld, deciding the fate of souls. Others depicted them as advisors, companions, or even rulers who handed down laws and customs to humans. The name Anunnaki itself meant offspring of Anu. To say their name was to invoke authority, ancestry, and cosmic order. Unlike later mythologies that often portrayed gods in fierce battles, the Sumerians' view of the Anunnaki was quieter, more bureaucratic, and strangely orderly. They were not just warriors or thunderbringers, they were keepers of balance, ensuring that the world unfolded as it should. Archaeologists, when they uncover broken tablets of cuneiform script, often find these names scattered like puzzle pieces. The Anunnaki appear in prayers, hymns, and laments. They are present when kings claim their authority, present when temples are raised, present when questions of life and death are asked. In this way, the Anunnaki were not distant myths. They were woven into the very fabric of everyday existence. As you imagine this ancient world, picture the soft glow of oil lamps flickering in a Sumerian household. The clay walls of mud brick houses radiate the warmth of the day. Outside, irrigation canals flow quietly, carrying the gift of water to fields of barley and wheat. In the night sky, stars shimmer gently, and to those watching, the Anunnaki are not abstract ideas but presences, perhaps hidden, perhaps mysterious, but always watching, always near. When later civilizations, like the Akkadians and Babylonians, inherited these traditions, the Anunnaki remained. Their roles shifted, their names evolved, but their presence never disappeared. From the first rise of cities to the later empires, they lingered like shadows on the horizon of myth. And so, our journey begins here, with a people whose stories have endured for over 5,000 years, whose quiet devotion to divine assemblies has left us with fragments of clay, fragments of prayer, and fragments of wonder. And as you listen, let the steady rhythm of these words carry you, gently and slowly, toward a state of rest. The story is long, the night is patient, and the Anunnaki wait for us to follow them deeper into history. When we seek the memory of the Anunnaki, we do not find it in great marble temples or golden inscriptions. Instead, we find it pressed into clay, small tablets no larger than the palm of a hand, baked by the warmth of ancient kilns, or sometimes hardened only by the slow touch of the desert sun. These tablets, marked with tiny wedge-shaped impressions known as cuneiform, hold the first written words of humanity, and among them, the earliest whispers of the Anunnaki. Imagine the scene. A quiet scribe sits cross-legged, a reed stylus in hand, carefully pressing signs into wet clay. Around him, the city hums faintly, the bray of donkeys, the murmur of market stalls, the shuffle of sandals upon dusty streets. But here, in this small, focused corner, history is being recorded. Words that once existed only in the fleeting air of speech now settle permanently into clay. With each mark, the myths grow heavier, more enduring. And so the Anunnaki step out of mere memory and into written form, preserved for thousands of years. Some of the earliest myths describe the Anunnaki as judges in the underworld. In those stories, they sat in council over the souls of the dead, deciding what fate awaited them in the shadowed realm below. Unlike later religious visions of bright heavens or fiery hells, the Sumerians imagined the afterlife as dim and dusty, a place of stillness rather than torment or joy. The Anunnaki, solemn and eternal, presided there like calm administrators, ensuring that even death followed order. Other tablets describe the Anunnaki as attendants to the greater gods, messengers, and keepers of decrees. They were sometimes pictured as a group of 50, or as countless in number, depending on the hymn. To chant their names was to call upon the entire assembly of divine authority, a chorus of order and tradition centuries past. The stories of the Anunnaki were copied and recopied. Scribes in Akkadian courts wrote them down in their own tongue, carrying Sumerian myths into new empires. Later still, Babylonian priests adapted the tales, giving the Anunnaki roles within their own cosmology. Each culture added layers, changing details but never erasing the presence of the divine assembly. Like echoes in a long hallway, the voice of the Anunnaki continued, softer each time, yet never completely silent. Archaeologists who uncover these tablets today often describe the experience as almost sacred. To brush away the dust of centuries and see the wedge-shaped marks appear is to feel the presence of an ancient mind. A scribe who lived 5,000 years ago, his name forgotten, his city reduced to ruins, still speaks through those clay marks. His hand, his stylus, his quiet dedication, all preserved in the fragile permanence of baked earth. And within those marks, the Anunnaki still live. For those listening tonight, drifting into rest, let this image stay with you, the soft scratch of reed against clay, the dim glow of an oil lamp, the slow unfolding of a story written not for a day, but for eternity. The Anunnaki, once whispered around hearths and temples, remain with us through the patience of scribes and the endurance of clay. If the Anunnaki were the great assembly of order, then one of their most enduring stories is about how order is kept when work was down, even the divine. In the Mesopotamian imagination, the world was not made in a single thunderclap, nor by a lonely god laboring in splendid isolation. It arose from councils and compromises, from responsibilities shared and shifted, from the soft yet firm pressure of tasks that must be done, canals to maintain, seasons to count, offerings to schedule, destinies to mark. Even the gods, it was said, once grew tired. There is a tale, preserved on tablets whose edges are chipped by long time, of the younger gods, the Igigi, who labored under the weight of creation. In the deep beginnings, when earth and sky had just learned their names, the Igigi were set to dig channels, to raise banks, to tend the scaffolds of the world so that waters would flow and fields would not drown. Night after night they lifted baskets, day after day they carved lines through mud and clay, until their breath turned rough and their shoulders burned. The Anunnaki, higher in rank, sat in council, kept calendars, adjusted decrees, watched the turning of stars. But it was the Igigi, patient and strong, who carried loads until their patience thinned like old cloth. In the hush of a certain night, the kind of night when reeds speak in a low, papery hiss, the Igigi gathered. The lamps of the camp were small fires, and shadows tipped like boats on their rims. Weariness spoke first, then grievance, but even grievance in these stories is not a shout. It is a slow exhale that reaches the ears of heaven. The young gods approached the gates of the divine assembly with their baskets dropped and their hands open. A gesture that said more clearly than any speech, the work as it stands cannot continue. Within the great council, the Anunnaki seated with the gravity of history, a conversation began. These tales never hurry. They take time to line up names, titles, relations, and duties. They take time to set the moral furniture of the world in its correct places. Enlil, lord of breath and authority, heard the complaint like the sigh of a whole season. Anu, the far dome of the sky, was silent as he often was, measuring the matter in the stillness that is his signature. And then Enki, of the fresh waters and the old cleverness, leaned forward in thought. Enki's wisdom in the stories is rarely a tempest. It is almost always a change of channel, a rebalancing of streams. He proposed a gentle, radical thing, to bring into the world a new race of workers who would share the burden, beings who could tend canals, count measures, sweep floors of temple courts, bring grain in a harvest, and watch the night fires so the gods could breathe easier. The proposal was not made with disdain. It had the tone of someone who knows that care is a kind of craft, and that new hands, if properly taught, can join the rhythm without breaking it. The manner of this making is told in varying ways across the tablets that survived. But a favorite thread moves like this: a god of intelligence or vigor, sometimes named Ilawela, offers up his life. A measure of his flesh and blood is mixed with clay. the same clay that scribes press with their reeds and that potters coax into bowls. In some versions, 7 wise women need this living earth, just as women need dough for bread, just as men and women need mud to fill the gaps of a house. The scene is domestic, almost ordinary, and that is its power. Humanity is not flung down in a flash. Humanity is worked into being, like something useful and intended, like an object formed to fit a hand. When the kneading is done, the first humans are lifted into the light of day. They blink and breathe. Their lungs, filled with the breath that is Enlil's to give, expand. Their bodies, shaped from the clay that is Earth's to share, bear the cool memory of the riverbed. They are not named as conquerors. They are not told to subdue. They are asked, gently and repeatedly, to help, to irrigate, to harvest, to repair, to count, to sing, to carry, to steward. In the long logic of Mesopotamia, this is how dignity begins, with participation in an order that is older than anyone's frustration and kinder than anyone's ambition. Offerings are arranged so that the gods are always fed, though the food circulates back through the temple households. Incense is burned so that the gods are always honored, though the scent settles sweetly on human hair and cloth. Humanity learns the ritual grammar, to pour water at dawn, to place bread at noon, to bank coals at night, to trace with careful fingers the same signs a scribe would press into clay. Not as writing but as gesture, acknowledgement that the day has a spine and that someone has paid attention to it. The rebellion of the Igigi is not told as a catastrophe. It is remembered, hushed, sober, as a negotiation that gave society its shape, God's balancing decree with compassion. Younger powers laying down their baskets, humans taking them up, but with wages in measure and festivals in season, with winters that rest and summers that work, with law to prevent the clever from cheating the tired, with calendars to ensure that no temple takes more than is owed. The Anunnaki, as the Great Assembly, oversee this reallocation and sign it, as it were, with silent assent. The world breathes easier. Once humans are in the world, the stories teach, the city expands its slow orbit. Clay tablets need more shelves. Irrigation schedules acquire a finer grain. Markets bloom with tools, fruits, and cloth. People are taught to count, pebbles in a bowl, lines on a tablet, notches on a stick, because fairness begins with knowing how much there is. They are taught to bury their dead kindly and to mark the year with small, repeated events, a day to cleanse the tools, a day to wash the statue, a day to share fish with neighbors, a day to carry the boat over the shallows because the water has pulled back. In all this quiet instruction, the Anunnaki are imagined as guardians of the pattern. Not rule breakers but rule keepers, easing hearts by keeping promises, sometimes. In later retellings, misfortune comes, floods, fevers, hushed warnings delivered in a dream. Even then, Enki whispers counsel, suggesting a boat, a wall, a reed hut to receive a message. But that is for another night. In the calm center of this tale, what matters is the agreement. The gods need breath. The world needs tending. Humans, born of clay and a divine share, are invited into the ongoing maintenance of meaning. Work is still work, with sweat and the familiar tiredness that comes to any back that bends. Yet within this order, rest is honored. Lamps are lit at dusk not to extend labor endlessly but to soften the evening. To remind hands and eyes that the day can be put away gently. So when you think of the origin of humanity in these stories, do not picture a sudden blaze or a sharp command. Picture hands in clay, steady and purposeful. Picture a bowl of water set nearby to moisten the mix. Picture a reed mat on the floor, the sound of quiet voices keeping time, the presence of watchful gods who choose patience over display. You and I, and those far-off ancestors at the river's edge, are included in that patience. We share in the long task and in the long rest. The Anunnaki are not a storm over us but a pattern around us, and within that pattern there is room to lay down the basket at day's end and sleep. Let the breath go out and come back in, regular as the old canals. Let the shoulders unclench, as the Igigi did when their burden was lifted. Let the mind settle, like clay finally drying into shape. The story has made its slow curve. A new day will come, and you will lift your basket again, but not tonight. Tonight there is only the murmur of water somewhere far off, the faint perfume of sesame oil, and the knowledge that the assembly above and the assembly below have agreed. There is a time for work, and there is a time for rest. To understand the Anunnaki, one must begin with their origin, the divine family from which they descended. At the highest point of the Mesopotamian pantheon stood Anu, the god of the sky, the great father who reigned over the heavens. His name was whispered in prayers as a source of authority, distant yet always present, like the endless vault of stars that stretched above the plains of Sumer. Anu was not always described in vivid detail. Rather, he was a presence, a name of immense weight, a title of supreme order. From him came the Anunnaki, the offspring of Anu, who inherited both his authority and his duty to oversee the balance of creation beside Anu. Or perhaps just beneath him, stood Enlil, the god of air, storms, and authority. Enlil's presence was felt in every gust of wind that swept across the fields and in the sudden storms that nourished crops or destroyed them. He was the god of kingship, the one who gave rulers their right to govern. Ancient hymns often declared that no king could sit upon a throne unless Enlil himself had chosen him. In this way, human politics and divine will were seen as inseparable. The Anunnaki, too, were often pictured as Enlil's companions or his court, standing in solemn assembly to confirm decrees and laws. Then there was Enki, also known later as Enki, was the god of wisdom, fresh waters, and creation. Where Enlil's power was authority and storm, Enki's gift was cleverness and life-giving knowledge. He was said to dwell in the Abzu, the underground sea of fresh water, from which rivers and springs emerged. Enki was a patron of craftsmen, scribes, and thinkers, an eternal reminder that civilization itself required both strength and wisdom. The relationship between Anu, Enlil, and Enki was more than myth. It was a mirror of how the Sumerians understood the world. The sky, the air, and the water were not just elements but living realities, given shape and purpose through divine order. And within this family of gods, the Anunnaki took their roles, attending to the affairs of both heaven and earth. In ancient Sumerian hymns, the Anunnaki are described as an assembly of 50 great gods, each with distinct tasks. Some were linked to the underworld, sitting as judges over the souls of the dead. Others were linked to the stars, guiding human destiny through the slow turning of constellations. Still others walked beside kings and priests, ensuring that temples were built, offerings made, and rituals performed correctly. The clay tablets, etched with careful wedge-shaped marks, preserve fragments of these beliefs. They speak of how the gods gathered in council, much like the city elders or kings gathered in court. The Anunnaki were not always distant, otherworldly beings. They were imagined as administrators, organizers, and keepers of divine law. This quiet, bureaucratic vision of the divine was deeply Mesopotamian. To them, order was sacred, and chaos was something to be guarded against as the soft winds of evening drift across your thoughts. Picture the temples of Uruk or Nippur rising high above their cities. Within their shadowed walls, priests chanted names of gods, listing them like rolls of officials, each fulfilling a role in the cosmic order. Outside, the everyday people tilled their fields, drew water from canals, or traded in bustling markets, never doubting that the Anunnaki were silently watching over all. In the long silence of history, these stories still whisper. The names of Anu, Enlil, and Enki echo faintly through millennia, carried on broken tablets and half-forgotten hymns. And always, surrounding them, are the Anunnaki, a great host of divine figures, keepers of balance, judges of fate, and watchers of the stars. Let this vision settle in your mind, a council beneath the heavens, seated in solemn silence, their decisions shaping both gods and men. It is a calm scene, an eternal assembly, as if the universe itself were governed by the quiet rhythm of order. As you rest, you may find that rhythm steadying your thoughts, carrying you gently into sleep. If clay tablets were the memory of Mesopotamia, then the sky was its clock, an immense, patient instrument whose hands were constellations and whose chime was the quiet return of seasons. To live under the gaze of the Anunnaki was, for ancient people, to live inside a calendar that could be felt in the skin as much as read with the eyes. The assembly of gods, said to sit among the stars as judges and witnesses, offered not flashes of lightning but regularity. And from that regularity, the first sciences of time unfolded like a scroll. Imagine a flat roof at night, plaster cool beneath the feet. A scribe climbs the stairs carrying a small board and a reed, an assistant with a bowl of water trailing softly behind. The city below exhales. Last ovens are entered, animals settle, voices dim to murmurs. Overhead, the sky is not merely decoration. It is instruction. The 7 planets that wander with a will of their own trace paths the priests have learned to follow with the steadiness of someone counting grain. Venus, called Dilbat, brilliant and insistent, announces herself in morning and evening. Jupiter, mul.sag.me.gar, walks like a dignitary among the fixed lights. Saturn, Ninib, takes his time. Mars gleams with a sharpened calm. Mercury darts and hides. The moon, sweet measurer, gnaws as a thin sickle and fattens to a round loaf, then thins again, setting the rhythm of months. The calendar is first felt at the riverbanks. When the Euphrates recedes just so, farmers open the small gates and say the name of a month that begins with water. When dust hangs longer than usual and reeds turn a shade paler, another month speaks. It is time to mend tools, to prepare for the harvest. To tell the same old story exactly as it was told last year because repetition is comfort. Temple administrators, who learned under the eyes of the Anunnaki that fairness is built on predictability, match the sky's rhythms with ledgers. Rations are listed not for a vague later but for a precise after the next new moon, and offerings are set for the 6th day, which is not superstition but coordination, a humane way to move together through work and rest.in the courtyards of Uruk and Nippur. On clay that has learned to hold numbers, the first mathematics grows, not as a trophy but as a tool. Base 60 is born of the way hands and eyes count the divisions of a circle and the segments of a day. Sexagesimal fractions slide neatly into place like well-made bricks. A scribe draws a small wedge for 10, another for 1. And in this simple duet all the variety of measure becomes possible. Jars of barley, cords of rope, spans of cloth, degrees in an arc the eye can follow but never touch. The Anunnaki, imagined as keepers of decrees, are felt here as keepers of intervals. A degree is a kind of promise. An hour is a courtesy extended to the future. Constellations are taught like neighbors. The plough rises. The old man leans. The swallow spreads faintly over the southern banks. The bull of heaven glows in a pattern whose horns the people know from the pens near the market. These star pictures receive hymns that are neither loud nor urgent. They are recitations meant to steady the heart. When the plough stands thus, an elder tells a child, we clean the channels. When the swallow turns, we check the nets. In this, the Anunnaki are not heavy with fate. They are courteous with guidance. Their judgments not iron bars but lines lightly ruled to help a hand write straight, and yet there is a room, inner, quiet, where the sky is studded with a seriousness that feels almost like prayer. There, priests keep lists, omens paired with outcomes, eclipses paired with harvests, unusual risings paired with the tenor of king's years. This is the early art of correlation, the world's first long spreadsheet, lines upon lines that do not insist but wonder. If the moon is eaten in the west, does the western province stumble next year? If Venus disappears longer than usual, do the canals hollow or overflow? The Anunnaki, imagined as judges, are invoked here not to fix destiny but to illustrate a principle. The world is coherent. If you pay attention, you may sow your days into that coherence and find fewer surprises tugging at the seam. The moon deserves its own paragraph. In the Mesopotamian night, it is a god with a schedule, and schedules are loved. New moon, a clean line on the tablet. First crescent, the first notch in a tally. Half, a pause to recenter. Full, a small festival whose joy is not wild but satisfied. Lamps on thresholds, bread slightly sweeter than usual, A story told an extra time because the story, like the moon, benefits from returning. When clouds cover the sky on the appointed night, someone climbs again, checks again, and writes softly, "Not seen," which is its own kind of seeing. The Anunnaki approve, so the hymns say, "Of such patience, below, in the soft early light, markets move by that patience. Weights are set out, stone and metal, touched with fingers that have learned their exactness. The scale is more than a tool. It is a moral instrument, a small public altar to fairness. If it tilts wrong, the city tilts wrong. So scribes check it, merchants respect it, and the names of gods are murmured when a deal is struck not as a threat but as a reminder. The assembly watches. In a world without clocks on walls, trust is the true timepiece. Sometimes the sky throws a louder note, a comet faint like a scratch, a blood-colored moon, a star that trembles near another. People look up but do not panic. The elders gather the younger in doorways and speak in that low, even tone that belongs to good teachers and kind priests. We have written this before, they might say, opening a jar and pulling out a tablet whose surface still shines after years in darkness. It has happened. It will pass. We will mark it, and we will sweep the courtyards tomorrow as planned. Amid what could be fear, the Anunnaki are remembered as steadying presences whose judgments are long, never rushed by an evening's rumor. What does it feel like to belong to such a sky? It feels like breathing with something larger. The day is not a fence that pens you in. It is a path that lays itself kindly before your feet, gates to open at dawn, ledges to balance at noon, braziers to bank at dusk. Children learn the names of months as they learn the names of their aunts. This is the month of plenty. We dry fish. This is the month of dust. We fix roofs. This is the month of quiet winds. We travel more. A traveling merchant measures distance by nights, not by miles but by how often the moon will rise before he is home. A shepherd teaches his son to find east not with a compass but with Orion's slow tilt and the memory of where reeds curl. Inside the temples, the mathematics of the sky turns into the music of ritual. Steps measured, words counted, offerings weighed. The choreography is as exact as an ephemeris. Priests do not rush. Rushing is a kind of error. They pause the way a star pauses before it clears a roofline. They speak in phrases that fall into the ear like constellations, small groups that make a larger picture if one stands still long enough. The Anunnaki are named, not to flatter but to sequence the world, this before that. Rest after effort, seed after flood, harvest after heat, story after supper, sleep after story. When the year turns and a new tally begins, clay tablets are washed of old chalk marks, shelves are rearranged, and the first oil of the first pressing is set aside with a pinch of salt. A boy is given a fresh stylus, the cut crisp, and told to practice the signs for month, stars, barley, just. He scratches them carefully. The way his mother trims frayed rope ends with her teeth and then smooths them with a wet thumb. Both are acts of maintenance, and maintenance is the true devotion of a people who learned from the Anunnaki that continuity is the gentlest miracle. If you are listening with the gentle fatigue that comes at day's end, let the geometry of the sky rest inside you. Picture the moon leaning toward full and then away, the planets walking their old roads, the constellations turning like a water wheel no hand pushes. Picture a tablet with neat lines, a scale that balances, a merchant's nod, a priest's even breath. The Anunnaki do not stride through this scene. They inhabit it as a kind of quiet lawfulness that asks nothing impossible of you, only to notice, to keep pace, to trust that tomorrow's stars will be arranged in the same kind shapes, and as your eyes grow heavy, think of a roof under the calm Mesopotamia night, a family on woven mats, the city murmuring like a distant river, and a scribe drawing one last wedge to mark the day complete. The moment the stylus lifts, the tablet becomes history, and the roof becomes home, and the sky, always, remains a clock you can sleep inside. If the sky gave Mesopotamia its rhythm and the canals gave it breath, then the temples gave it texture, the soft weave of tasks repeated without hurry, the kindly friction of daily duties that polished both objects and souls. In this world, devotion was not a blaze but an ember, not a spectacle but a sequence. The Anunnaki were honored not by thunder but by care, measured flour, clean water, well-trimmed wicks, ledgers kept neat, doors that did not creak because someone remembered the drop of oil.at dawn. Courtyards grew pale as if the light were being sifted through fine cloth. A junior priest crossed the paving stones with a small pail of water and a bundle of reeds. He moved as others moved, unhurried, precise, because ritual does not like to be chased. The first act was always cleansing, hands washed, the threshold sprinkled, the stone basin wiped in a slow circle. The Anunnaki are named here in a whisper that sounds almost like breathing, one name per motion, one motion per breath, so that no step appears lonely. Dust understands and lifts itself from corners. I in a side room. The baker priests were already working. Temple bread was simple by design. Flour sifted, water added, salt measured with the small pinch that decades of practice make exact. The dough was kneaded against a low table polished by hands, then patted into rounds that kept their shape like moons on a long night. In clay ovens, the heat accumulated without fuss. Loaves were turned with a wooden paddle worn to satin. When the first bread swelled and darkened at the edge, someone smiled, not triumph, only recognition. The day's first offering is ready. And in being ready it has made the morning true. Next came beer. Not the noisy drink of taverns but the mild, nourishing ale meant for tables sacred and ordinary alike. Barley and emmer, steeped and dried, gave themselves to water again. A sweet smell like memory rose from big jars. The brewer dipped a cup and tasted for balance. He adjusted by feel, by the way the liquid spoke against the lip of the vessel. To brew was to practice fairness in another tongue. Nothing too harsh, nothing too thin. He marked a tally on a waxed board and, when it had dried enough, onto clay. Numbers bring offerings into conversation with time. In the incense room, a woman in linen lifted a lid from a chest of resins. The breath that swelled into the air felt like a small festival. Myrrh and juniper, a crumble of cedar, a memory of frankincense used only on high days. She mixed yesterday's remainder with today's measure, because the gods, like people, prefer continuity to waste. Charcoal was banked with a delicate stick until it glowed the color of fruit at dusk. When the first curl of scented smoke rose, she cupped it gently toward the inner door. Care can be directed without being insistent. Offerings were set according to a choreography no one living had invented and no one dared to rush. Bread before beer, beer before incense, incense before light. Lamps were trimmed and lit so that their flames stood upright, little witnesses whose voices were steady. A senior priest checked wicks with a practiced glance. He had learned which oil burned clean and how to lift a lamp without making its light tremble. There is affection in competence. The Anunnaki were honored by that affection, beyond the screen that hid the shrine from common traffic. The statue, God as resident, was bathed and anointed, then clothed in clean textiles whose hems were mended in quiet corners by hands that did not seek to be seen. Old garments were folded away in a cedar chest, not discarded. They had worn the shape of devotion and would return on another day. Jewelry was unhooked and replaced, not for glitter but for remembrance. This amulet given by that king. This pendant offered after a good harvest. This collar returned to the statue after it had been borrowed, as custom allowed, to sanctify a marriage bed outside. The steward arrived to check storerooms. He carried a tablet on which yesterday's receipts glowed faintly. Jars were tapped. Oil speaks when you touch it. Their seals read, their levels compared with marks scratched low on the wall. He greeted the porter, asked after an aunt who had been ill, and made a small joke about the stubborn hinge on the western door. Bookkeeping and kindness kept each other honest. When a figure refused to match a memory, he looked again. Errors were corrected with the lightest pressure, a stylus tip against damp clay, a word spoken without blame. In such rooms the Anunnaki felt most like law, gentle, exact, humane. Midday brought petitioners, a woman with a basket of dates to thank the gods for her brother's safe return from a caravan. A farmer with a measure of fish to ask for clean water next month. A mason with an offering of fresh plaster to repair a crack found in the outer wall. Their gifts were small but orderly, wrapped right, weighed right, recorded right. The priest listened more than he spoke. He placed a hand on a shoulder when words did not arrange themselves easily. Leaving, each petitioner felt a little straighter, as if the city had aligned itself with their day. If a loaf or a scoop of grain was quietly pressed back into a palm for supper, no one called it charity. The temple had been fed, so the city could be fed. When shadows lengthened, music softened the air. A harp strings were plucked with fingertips that had also spun wool that morning. A boy kept time on a small frame drum, 3 taps and a pause, 3 taps and a pause, while he watched the senior musician's left hand for the moment to breathe. Hymns named the Anunnaki one after another, and the list itself was the lullaby. When the songs ended, the quiet they left behind felt like a blessing that did not need words on high days. The sequence expanded. Processions through streets dusted clean at dawn, textiles unfurled from beams. A litter borne on shoulders that had been rubbed with sesame oil so they would not ache. The statue travelled, seeing its own city as if for the first time, the way a person sometimes needs to step outside a familiar room to remember it. Laughter floated but never swelled enough to break the shape of the ritual. At crossroads, a figurine of clay was buried with a pinch of salt to keep mischief wandering and welcome anchored as night approached. Priests reversed the day with care. Lamps were fed rather than left hungry. Ashes were gathered from braziers and placed where wind would not scatter them rudely. Doors were latched not with a slam but with a soft click that said, "The house keeps itself." In the ledger, a last line was drawn. A wax seal pressed. A breath released. One by one, names of the Anunnaki were spoken again, not as a roll call to catch absence but as a thanks for presence manifested in ordinary success. Unburned bread, unspilled oil, unbroken jars, unhurt hands. I in their homes. The same gestures repeated at a smaller scale, a mother wiping a bowl in a circle that matched the basin in the temple, a father trimming a wick, a child laying out tomorrow's reeds for school, a grandmother smoothing the edge of a woven mat until its stray fibers lay down like reeds after wind. The sacred and the common mirrored each other so closely that the distance between them nearly vanished. The Anunnaki liked it that way, said the old men sitting by the door. It kept the world from lurching that if you listen closely now, to your own room. At this hour, you might hear the echo of that choreography, a page turned, a light adjusted, a glass set down with a care that has nothing to prove. This is the speech the Anunnaki preferred, tasks performed as if time itself were listening, as if quiet were a partner and not a void. In such a life, sleep comes not as an escape but as a continuation, the day slowly lowering itself onto the night the way a lid settles onto a well-made jar. Let the image rest with you, bread cooling on a wooden paddle. Steam a ribbon in the lamplight. Incense a slow river. A ledger closed. A door that knows how to close itself. The assembly above requires no thunder from you, only that you place things where they belong, and then place yourself where you belong, in the soft center of your own breath, at the edge of dreaming. Long before a crown glittered on any brow, Mesopotamia imagined kingship as something that did not arise from ambition alone but descended, gently, ceremonially, from the wide stillness of heaven. The phrase appears again and again in the oldest accounts, pressed into clay with the same patience used to mark rations and harvests. When kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu, then in Bad Tibira, then in Larag, then in Zimbia. So begins the Sumerian king list, a document that sounds less like triumph and more like a breathing exercise. Names and years, cities and transfers, meant to steady a people on the long road of time. The Anunnaki, imagined as the great assembly of order, do not shout in these lines. They ratify. Their presence is the signature beneath history, the quiet yes that allows a city to turn its tasks without squeak or grind. To picture an enthronement day in this world is to watch slowness wear its finest garment. The city rises early, streets washed and sprinkled against dust, doorways brushed with water and a little salt. In the temple precinct, a group of elders sits in shade, linen cool on the skin, tablets ready, faces that have learned the economy of expression. The candidate, who already bears the weight of logistics and the memory of field Levi schedules, is led inward not by trumpets but by procedure. A priest pronounces names, Anu, Enlil, Enki, small pauses between them so that silence can assent. The Anunnaki are invoked not to make a man larger but to make the task fittable to human size. Counsel sought. Law obeyed, measures kept straight. There is a staff placed in the hand, not merely a symbol of power, but of responsibility that functions like a tool. A ring or cord is given, to bind promises to practice. In some cities, a plough is lifted, the earth scratched lightly in the temple court, a reminder that kingship without fields is a cloud that never rains. The king touches the measuring rod, its length checked against old marks, and a rope, its span compared to last year's, and in that contact the city hears the sermon without words. Justice is a matter of exactness. The assembly above approves when the assembly below takes care that 1 cubit today matches 1 cubit tomorrow. Such ideals are not left in litanies. They are stored in law. Before Babylonia's high centuries, before the famous stele, there were contracts and oaths, reed-stylus agreements pressed into damp clay. Edges rolled with cylinder seals that left small rivers of images. A king presented before a seated god. A pair of clasp hands, a barley head, a star. Cylinder seals did more than prevent tampering. They were miniature prayers for fairness. When a jar of oil changed hands, a strip of wet clay was wrapped around the stopper and sealed. When the jar reached its destination unbroken, the city felt a little safer. The Anunnaki did not tip the scale. They watched the scale being set right and let that watching become a custom that was hard to break. In the courts, matters unfolded with the same unhurried clarity. A scribe read the charge in a voice that carried but never pressed. Witnesses stepped forward with palms open to show they had nothing concealed, then touched a small bowl of water, a gesture older than anyone present. To lie under oath was to waste water, to misuse the world. Sometimes a dispute turned on barley. How many measures, taken when, weighed on which stones? Sometimes on a boundary. Was the marker a foot east or west after the flood drew back? The judge, who had once been a market steward and still remembered the smell of damp baskets, listened for pattern. Decisions, when they came, rarely pleased everyone, but they left the pattern intact, and that is a kind of mercy. Kingship in these lands was maintenance elevated to ceremony. A good year's work was summarized simply: canals cleared in the month of first winds, embankments patched after the third high water, reed boat licenses recounted, temple roofs replastered, garrison pay sent before heat settled, when seals rolled cleanly and ledgers matched. The king's name went into the year notation with a feeling nearly domestic. Year the north sluice was rebuilt, year of plenty barley. Year the city wall was made whole again. The Anunnaki were praised on those days not for miracles but for continuity. Of course, kings boasted. Even careful men are tempted by the bright surface of words. But boasting itself had a grammar. When a ruler spoke of victories, he nested his claims in the language of order, enemies who upset the measure, who clogged the channels, who refused the fair scale. To defeat them was to tidy the house. Even conquest was framed as repair. On stele and bricks, the divine signs were cut not merely to dazzle but to bind, because I measured rightly. Enlil favored me. The people who read such claims in courtyards, squinting in noon light, did not swoon. They compared. Had rations remained steady? Were temple wages paid on the right moon? Did the gate hinges squeal less the spring? The Anunnaki's favor, like rain, was judged by how evenly it fell. The Sumerian king list itself, so calm in its roll of names, holds a lesson about impermanence taught without panic. Kingship passes from city to city. Dynasties rise, lengthen, thin, end. Numbers swell to impossible lengths in the remotest past, then settle toward the human scale as memory grows sharper. It is not a trick. It is a gesture of reverence for beginnings and a sober eye for the present. What matters is that the line does not break. A child can trace it with a finger, murmuring city names the way one murmurs the names of cousins. The Anunnaki are there between each link, not pushing, not pulling, only holding the shape while people shuffle forward, beneath the visible kingship. Another crown rests on humble heads, scribes, who rule the small empire of signs, weighers, who keep the throne level by watching the pans, canal wardens, who govern with shovels, midwives and healers, whose knowledge is a law older than any edict. They receive no oaths of fealty and stand on no platforms, but when they work well. The king's reign is said to be in favor, a phrase that means children sleep and bread browns without burning and the wind forgets to lift the roof edges at night. Sometimes law must bend to keep from breaking. A poor debtor brings a jar and a promise. A widow arrives with a son who is still too small to lift a basket. A farmer whose field was flooded asks for a remission of barley dues. The judge consults not only the written lines but the unwritten ones, the flex in tradition that lets communities breathe. An edict is proclaimed for a season, interest forgiven, pledges returned. Clay tablets are wiped clean with water. Seals are rolled again over fresh surfaces. The Anunnaki, imagined as judges of the underworld, are here felt as forgivers of the daylight world, where mercy is simply math applied with attention to weather and human weight. Even punishments are designed to teach balance. A false measurer must stand by the public scale and measure fairly all morning, watched by children who giggle at his solemnity. A man who moved a boundary stone must carry stones to repair a canal he does not use. Shame is not the goal. Re-entry is. The city is a loom, and penalties are threads pulled back into pattern rather than cut and thrown away. When the sun sets on such a day, the air feels slightly smoother, like a door that no longer grates to year's end. The king visits storerooms and takes a tour of ledgers. He does not pry. He observes. A steward opens a jar, another reads a line, a third shows a seal that has not been broken since planting. In the temple court, an ox is led in a circle and touched on the forehead, not as spectacle but as punctuation. A prayer is spoken that sounds like instructions, and instructions are given that sound like prayer. Measure carefully. Sweep the threshold. Keep the lamps upright. Write the day complete. The Anunnaki are named once more. Their assembly invoked to settle the city into the new count. If you listen closely, you can hear how this all becomes a lullaby. Kingship descended, kingship moved, measures matched. Debts were weighed, channels cleared, doors closed, night came. The words line themselves like bricks, and the breath that passes between them is easy. The world, with its frictions and floods, has not been conquered. It has been arranged again for another season. Let this thought find a place under your ribs as you rest. Justice as measurement, power as caretaking, law as the poetry of things placed where they belong. The Anunnaki do not stride in armor through this scene. They sit patiently at the edge, the way good elders do, making space for the young to carry the pattern forward. And when the lamps are finally lowered and the seal is pressed into the last soft line of clay, the city exhales. Somewhere a child turns on her mat and sighs. Somewhere a gate clicks shut. Somewhere a king places the staff on a stand and closes his eyes, a servant covering it with cloth. The law sleeps, and so may you. Before empires marched, before laws were carved in stone for all to see, there was the gentle industry of a room where children sat cross-legged, reeds in hand, and clay waited like patient earth. The Sumerians called it the edubba, the house of tablets, and within its shaded walls the city taught itself to remember. Here, the Anunnaki were not imagined as thunderers but as patrons of order, presences that smiled. If gods can be said to smile. Whenever a sign was made correctly, a line kept straight, a number added and found to fit dawn, when courtyards were still cool and the first braziers had only just been coaxed to life. A boy or girl, hair bound back with a strip of cloth, would step over a low threshold into the schoolroom. The room did not shine. It breathed. Reed mats softened the floor. Bundles of styluses, trimmed to different widths, lay in small baskets. A water bowl glinted near the doorway for moistening clay. On a long bench, blank tablets rested like unbaked loaves, each one a promise that the day could be arranged into meaning. There was a master, grey about the temple, who did not hurry his speech, and an assistant who had a quick hand for smoothing clay when errors had to be washed away and tried again. The first lessons were shapes, the small wedge for 1. The longer wedge for 10, the tiny diagonal that gave a sign its breadth. The careful spacing that made the difference between barley and beer, between sheep and goat, between month and moon. A child learned to press, not scratch. To place, not jab. To lift the stylus cleanly so the clay would not blur. The city had discovered long before that accuracy begins in the hands, fingers that know how much weight to give, wrists that know when to pause. The Anunnaki, keepers of decrees and intervals, were invoked softly when a page, no, a tablet, was filled without smudge. A small name list of gods and cities might be chanted, not to impress them, but to lull the students into the rhythm of right sequence. By mid-morning, the school widened its circle. There were lexical lists, long, soothing progressions of things that belonged together. A tablet might read, rope, basket, boat, water, canal, sluice, lake, bread, flour, oven, ash. Another tablet would list birds, then fish, then herbs that settled a stomach, then stones that turned a knife's edge. The students copied line by line, rocking very slightly as they murmured the signs. Copying was not a punishment but a devotion. The city taught its world by gathering it into tidy lines and letting those lines live in children's mouths until the knowledge felt like breath. Numbers followed words, and numbers led to measures. The master drew a short table of capacity signs and set a jar beside it. This much oil is owed for this much barley, he explained, tapping the jar's shoulder with a knuckle so the clay echoed softly. A boy poured water in, then out, to catch the feel of a mina, a shekel, a gur. A girl checked a balance scale with pebbles and bits of fired clay. If the pans matched, a satisfied quiet settled over the room. The Anunnaki were not invoked as threats here. They were remembered as the custom behind fairness. A scale that balanced meant the city could rest its head. Sometimes the day's work was lists of names, kings in order, rivers from mouth to source, gods as they appear in certain hymns. The famous Sumerian king list might be sung, not for glory but for continuity. The children traced the line with styluses the way a mother might trace a scar that has healed well. When kingship descended, the master intoned, it was in Eridu. The names moved like a slow boat down a long canal. In that boat sat the assembly of the Anunnaki as idea rather than figure, order that does not press, pattern that guides a hand without closing a fist around it. On some days, a visitor arrived, a merchant with a cylinder seal, a canal warden with a map cut into clay, a baker priest with a ledger stained faintly with oil. They spoke in the even tone of people who know their craft. The merchant rolled his seal across a little slab, and its images stood up crisp and sure, the tiny figure of a king before a god, the sprig of barley, the star. A seal is a promise, he said simply. If you break it, you must answer to the scale. The canal warden laid out a small plan with labels and taught a quick thumb measure for a cubit of reed. The baker priest showed how a ration list was built, names down the left, measures across the top, checks and marks that meant bread would meet hands at the right hour. The students saw how the city turned not on speeches but on ledgers. There was discipline, yes, but it was more form than fear. The master's reed could sting a careless wrist, though more often he corrected by erasing, smoothing the tablet with 2 thumbs until the mistake vanished into wetness, then placing the clay back into the student's hands with a nod that said, try again. Let the hand remember what the mind forgot. A bad line could be wiped. A bad habit took longer, but the school gave it time. We are not carving stone, the master liked to say. We are carving custom. The students laughed softly at the joke, already old in his mouth. In the corner, a jar held tablets from years past, the practice pieces of older siblings and uncles, kept because their errors had turned into histories of improvement. At midday, when the light sharpened and shadows hid under benches, the assistant fetched bread and dates from a small basket. The children ate without chatter, their voices unwilling to stir the room's quiet. A jug of watered beer passed from hand to hand. The master set aside a small loaf and a pinch of salt to take later to a shrine built into the school's outer wall. No ritual was too small to notice. The Anunnaki were thanked for stillness, for warm clay that did not crack, for the simple luxury of a day without interruption. The afternoon curriculum belonged to stories, not wild ones. Though children love wildness, but the slow-breathing epics that matched the city's heartbeat. The master lifted a tablet and, in a measured voice, read from a tale of Enki and Ninhursag, pausing to explain a sign here, a place name there, a pun that only reveals itself when a word is seen and heard at once. Wisdom, he told them, is a canal with many bends. Another day it was a hymn to Inanna, where the young goddess goes to the underworld and returns. And the master traced each descent and ascent with the stylus so the children could see how stories are also maps. The Anunnaki flickered through these texts as the assembly behind the assembly, the listeners behind the judges, the calm beneath the cleverness. Older students learned to compose, a receipt for 5 jars of sesame oil, an oath declaring a boundary fixed from the standing tamarisk to the stone that bears the mark of the fish. A short hymn that named the gods in an order that made sense to the mouth. They wrote and rewrote, turning the tablet to use each face, then handing it to the assistant to be baked lightly if it was to be kept, or to be washed if it was only a day's step in a longer walk. A baked tablet was a door that closed gently. A washed tablet was a door left open for more practice tomorrow to iron the late afternoon. The school played quietly with astronomy. The assistant sketched a crescent, then a half, then a full round, and the children labelled them with month names like family members, names that tasted of flood, heat, reaping, dust. On a good day, they climbed to the roof and the master pointed to where Venus would follow the sun down. He spoke of how a priest on a far roof might be noting the same thing, and how both men, without meeting, were bound by the calendar they kept together. This is the assembly, he said, glancing upward not to a throne but to a timetable. Not a shout, but an agreement. Sometimes, a tablet from long ago, found in a jar during a repair, or brought by a trader from another city, came into the room. Its signs would be archaic, its surface chipped. The children circled it as if around an elder. There is a hush that even the youngest understand when a voice from very far leans in. The master did not treat such tablets like trophies. He read as well as he could, then laughed gently at the places where the script had tricked him. And the children laughed with him, warmed by the idea that even a master misses and corrects a day's end. The room reversed itself with the same courtesy taught in the temples. The students smoothed their practice tablets with damp palms and stacked them chisel edge to chisel edge so they would not stick. Styluses were wiped and sorted by size. The water bowl was emptied and turned so dust could not settle in the last drops. The master took up the little loaf he had set aside and the pinch of salt and, at the shrine niche, pressed his seal lightly into a scrap of clay as he whispered a short thanks for a day without breakage. The seal's image, 2 figures before a star, seemed to say that learning itself was an offering, that memory kept carefully was a form of worship. Then the children went home along paths that knew their fate. One would pause to watch a potter lean into his wheel. Another would gape at a weaver counting warp threads with a song. A third would linger at a stall where a scribe tallied fish and smiled to see the child mouth the numbers ahead of him. In courtyards, mothers rinsed bowls. Fathers trimmed wicks. Grandparents told small stories. And the city closed the day the way a tablet receives its last line, with care. Overhead, the first stars pricked through. The Anunnaki, who had presided over the schoolroom without ever entering, were felt in the simple fact that tomorrow would know where to begin. If the rivers were the veins of Mesopotamia and the tablets its memory, then the ziggurats were its posture, how a city held itself in the presence of the sky. These stepped mountains, lifted carefully from level plains, did not brag the way later monuments sometimes do. They accumulated, course by course, brick by brick, like a sentence that grows calm and complete by repeating a few good words. To stand near one at dawn was to feel that stone, or more truly, clay, could be taught to breathe with the same patient rhythm the people used to cook, to count, to sing. The making of a ziggurat began not with a shout but with a measurement. Priests and builders walked the naked ground with cords stretched between stakes, a plumb bob nodding like a sleepy eye, a measuring rod laid along the line so that length would not wander. A senior builder rubbed a little clay between his fingers to taste its grit, then nodded to a boy to fetch water from a particular reach of canal where silts settled to the right fineness. In jars, the clay was mixed with straw and chaff and, sometimes, with a whisper of bitumen to help it hold the shape it would have to hold for centuries. The first bricks were pressed in molds and set out in rows like sleeping animals, the sun taking its time to harden them into statements. Everyone helped, though not all at once. Carters brought reeds for scaffolding. Potters lent their eyes to judge when bricks were dry enough to lift without smearing their edges. Water carriers moved in slow relays so that no builder would need to shout for a drink. Women sang a work song whose beat made bricks rise into the air and find their place with less effort, as if the air itself had agreed to help for a while. No one praised the Anunnaki with fireworks. They praised them by alignment, keeping edges true, corners fair, steps even, so the structure would carry itself upward without strain. The base was always broad, earth remembering itself as mountain. Upon it, tiers rose, 2, 3, sometimes 7, each smaller than the one below, each bound to the next by stairways that seemed to move even when empty. Those stairs were the building's grammar, telling feet where to go and hands where to rest. They were not meant for crowds. Ziggurats do not swallow people with grand entrances. They invite a few at a time, priests, caretakers, sometimes a king on festival days, to ascend slowly, to feel breathing settle, to notice the city shrinking to a model at their backs while the sky grows larger with every step. At the summit, a shrine waited, not a cavernous hall but a room, intimate enough to hear the softest prayer. Walls were washed with lime and sometimes covered with a thin skin of glazed bricks that caught the light like wet leaves. The door faced a direction chosen by tradition, by the memory of where the first builders had looked when they called the place holy. Inside, a low stand, an oil lamp, a basin. You could call it sparse, or you could call it exact. The Anunnaki, invoked in assemblies below, were here felt as a presence of space, nothing crowded, nothing lost. Everything given a little air so it could mean what it meant without strain. From the city, the ziggurat's outline told time. In the sharp mornings of harvest, its shadow pointed like a finger along the avenue. At noon it tucked itself beneath the uppermost tier. In the late afternoon it stretched toward the river where boys splashed and shouted before being shooed home. Mothers used the shadow as a clock. When it reaches the fig tree, come back. Scribes used it as a straightedge to align the edges of mats upon which tablets were dried. The building was a tool, a civic instrument that played sunlight. Maintenance was a liturgy of its own. Plaster cracked in heat. Men climbed with baskets, mixed new plaster on the platform, and spread it with the motion of smoothing a child's hair. Bitumen oozed and had to be tamped. Reeds frayed and needed binding. A stair's lip broke and was replaced quietly before anyone could catch a toe. The city felt better, more itself, when the ziggurat looked cared for. Children rehearsed their numbers counting steps. Elders rested at landings to tell a small story that required exactly that length of breath to finish. Festivals changed the building's temperature without changing its pace. On New Year rites or holy days named for the city's patron, the ziggurat became a spine down which the city's attention flowed. Priests ascended with offerings, bread wrapped in cloth to keep it warm, small bowls of beer, strings of dates, smouldering incense carried in bronze that did not burn the hands. Musicians did not climb. They played below, letting notes spiral upward like smoke, the stairways becoming flutes that sent sound along their edges. A king might climb in embroidered linen, sandals oiled so the straps would not bite his ankles. He would pause at each landing, not to pose but to breathe, for he had rehearsed this climb in his dreams as a way to gather himself before addressing heaven in the smallest possible voice. The city saw itself reflected in the building. In dry seasons, the ziggurat looked pale and precise. After rain, it darkened to a deeper note, as if accepting a lesson. Pigeons took possession of a few niches. Children used the lowest steps to play at markets or councils, arranging pebbles as if they were jars of oil, pretending to seal them with invisible seals. Couples promised each other small things on the middle stairs, to share dates more fairly, to keep the roof mat mended, to say the child's name softly when he twitched in sleep. These were domestic vows, but they felt more durable when spoken within the building's measured presence. Stories gathered around ziggurats the way mist gathers around reeds. A builder swore that, early one morning, he saw a line of light running up a stair like water briefly changed into silver. A priestess, older than most, insisted that the upper rooms smelled different each month, sometimes of river mud, sometimes of cedar, sometimes of the first press of oil. A night watchman claimed he had once heard a laugh from high above when no one was there. He did not call it a god's laugh, only a sign that the building remembered all the people who had climbed it over the years and was capable of repeating their gentlest sounds. There are lists of famous ziggurats: Enlil Enki in Babylon, house of the foundation of heaven and earth; Iana's great platforms in Uruk; Enlil's mountain in Nippur. But even a small city's platform mattered as much to its people as those known by distant names. A modest ziggurat still stitched earth to sky. It still declared, without arrogance, that human hands could build a vertical agreement with the world. Farmers measured their pride by the straightness of its edges. Mothers prayed the simple prayer, "Let it stand," meaning, "Let our pattern hold." At night, the ziggurat receded into outline. Lamps in upper rooms made warm islands that insects discovered and circled. Guards leaned on spears and breathed in the smell of baked clay that still held the day's heat. The city grew quiet, but the platform did not sleep the way rooms sleep. It rested the way a thought rests when it no longer needs rehearsing. From rooftops, families looked up and saw it against the stars. A stare that ended just before the sky began, as if to say that between people and heavens there should always be a small respectful distance, bridged not by conquest but by courtesy. If someone grieved, they climbed. If someone felt proud, they waited and did not climb until the feeling softened. If someone was confused, they sat on the lowest step and counted, to 10, to 60, to whatever number returned their breath to a useful cadence. The ziggurat did not answer riddles. It helped reshape the question so the questioner could carry it gracefully. From below, a priest's litany might rise late, the names of the Anunnaki spoken with spaces between, allowing each name to sit like a brick laid well, the wall growing soundlessly with every pause. In time, as empires shifted and tongues changed, ziggurats crumbled. Raw bricks returned to the state from which they'd come. Reed, rope, plaster, bitumen loosened their handshake with the air. But even then, even as hills of memory, they taught. Shepherds used them as markers, merchants as waypoints, lovers as excuses to walk a little farther into evening, and archaeologists, brushing dust a grain at a time, found under the fallen faces the footprints of patience, brick lines that did not wander, stair angles that held to their long agreement, drains set with the intelligence of people who understood that water's mind must be respected if walls are to stay. If you are lying awake now and wishing for a stair that would lead you out of thought, imagine the measured climb of a ziggurat at dusk. Feel each step receive your foot. Hear your breathing smooth. Let the city's noises fall behind like tools put away. At the top, where the room is simple and expects nothing dazzling, set down what you carried: a worry, a plan, a name, and light a small lamp. Watch the flame stand upright. Know that below you, the city belongs to the same law that holds this flame steady: order without sharpness, height without haughtiness, devotion without demand. Then descend with the same care, and when you reach the ground will feel like a gift again. Sleep comes easiest in places that have learned how to stand. Ziggurats stood for lifetimes by practicing what the people practiced: measure, maintenance, mercy. Let that be your architecture tonight. Stack your breaths like bricks. Bind them with the mortar of small, repeated kindnesses. And allow the darkness to be not a pit but a platform on which your dreams can climb a few polite steps toward the stars. If temples taught the city how to breathe and ziggurats taught it how to stand, then trade taught it how to reach, not with a shout, but with an outstretched hand that knew the weight of a jar and the length of a promise. In Mesopotamia, roads did not roar. They murmured. They were made of compacted dust and footfall, of reed boat wake and the creak of leather straps, of lists kept in careful rows and seals that rolled cleanly over damp clay. In such a world, the Anunnaki were felt as witnesses to exchange, presences that smiled whenever a measure matched. A tally agreed. A journey returned with all the knots still in their proper places. A T first light. River mist hung low and cool. Boatmen moved in silhouettes, reed bundles glistening, hulls smelling faintly of bitumen and wet fibre. The river was a road with its own traffic laws, currents that argued softly around bends, shoals that remembered last year's flood and waited under the surface like old stories. A helmsman tapped the gunwale in a pattern to guide his bowmen through the narrow places. Not a language, but a rhythm everyone aboard understood. Cargo was lashed with braided rope whose familiarity comforted the hand. Every knot had its purpose, every hitch a place in the boat's small grammar. The Anunnaki, invoked in temple courts, were here present as that regularity which lets weight remain weight without becoming worry. On the banks, wharves were little worlds. Porters formed chains that moved jars hand to hand, a human river whose current did not spill. Scribes squatted on low stools, tablets balanced on knees, styluses tapping a quiet percussion as they matched seal to sender, weight to word. When a jar of sesame oil was lifted from the boat, a strip of clay on its stopper bore the seal of the farmstead where its seed had been pressed. The receiver, before breaking the clay, admired the tiny procession engraved on it: a king before a god, a star, a sprig of barley. To roll a seal was to say, "I remember." To read one was to answer, "So do I." Inland, the caravan roads kept their own steady pulse. Donkeys padded in single file with bells so small that only the attentive heard their conversation. Loads were balanced so that no animal would begin the day with a complaint in its bones. The lead handler, a man with a voice like worn leather, spoke rarely, then only to adjust pace for shade or water. Camps were chosen for their wind, how it moved through low scrub, how it promised a night free of wasps, and for the curve of ground that would cradle sleeping animals. In the ledger, distances were not measured as crows fly, but as nights. 3 new moons to the copper mines. 1 full moon and a half to the cedar hills. A long sliver's width to the first market where lapis traders liked to gather. Words drifted into the campfire talk at dusk. Dilmun, a memory of a bright island where fresh water rose like treasure in brackish wells. Magan, where copper came out of mountains patiently, hammered into ingots shaped like oxides. Maluha, a far sound, fragrant with stories of woods that stain the hands and beads the color of deep sea. The children listened with half-closed eyes, not to chase marvels, but to learn the cadence by which distances enter the heart without frightening it. Trade, like ritual, reassured. If you left at a certain hour and kept a certain pace, the world would meet you in the middle. The market, tents flapped like gentle lungs. Woven mats defined stalls that felt as permanent as a family's favorite bowl and as temporary as a tent peg pulled up at dusk. Scales were set in the open where the sun could judge as well as people. Weight stones were stroked like pets, their edges smoothed by generations of fair hands. A brewer's wife poured a taste of new ale into a cup rinsed in clear water and wiped with the clean hem of a robe. A potter wrapped the rim of a jar to let its note prove its soundness better than he could with words. A scribe wrote receipts in a script that had learned to be gracious even when it needed to be exact. When 2 merchants disagreed by a hair, they laughed softly and chose the middle. When they disagreed by more, they summoned the judge whose ears had grown wise from listening to the scale. Between towns, way stations formed pearls on the threads of long routes. Their wells were kept by families who understood how to speak to travelers, a handful of dates placed in a quiet bowl. A gesture toward a shaded corner, a price spoken once and then left alone so that water might ease the words and not harden them. On a shelf, messages sat in clay envelopes, seals unbroken, waiting for hands that would know them. To carry a letter from one station to the next was work more honorable than a big boast. It was the small honor of being trusted to keep another's thought warm until it found its owner again. There were storms, of course, and swollen rivers, and rumors that walked like dust devils. The road had its moods, and so did the sea. When trouble came, it came as a change in texture, rope that felt wrong in the hand, sky that rushed in a way no elder memory liked, animals whose ears stayed turned the same way all day. The response was not drama but adjustment. A caravan might wait a day in a hollow that had held other caravans on other years. A boat might hug the reed beds and polite its way along with poles when the wind proved faithless. To fight the world was considered a kind of foolishness. To listen to it was an art. The Anunnaki, imagined as keepers of decrees, were honored not by triumph over weather but by reading it. On festival seasons, pilgrims walked the same roads as traders, and the two groups recognized each other by how carefully they placed their feet. A pilgrim carried bread and a small jar of oil. A trader carried contracts in a skin pouch, 3 extra seals, and a memory for prices his father had told him. When they shared a fire, stories braided, a hymn line that calendared the year, a bit of advice about a crooked ditch on the North Road, a laugh about a landlord who always forgot which door hinge squeaked. The friendship was not loud. It was practical and beautiful in that way. Sometimes, a gift preceded trade the way dawn precedes day. A bowl of figs passed before the talk turned to wool. A small figurine placed at a shrine before a larger deal went forward. A cup of beer poured onto ground for luck in a way that admitted luck's smallness and order's largeness. Even bargaining had a chorus, the repeated gestures, the way hands opened and closed over empty air as if to weigh an invisible jar, the little silence after a number that allowed both parties to reconsider without losing face. In that silence, the Anunnaki were present as the permission to be fed at the far edges, where Mesopotamian speech began to braid with other tongues. Trade taught the city to listen with its eyes. A bead said Maluha even if no one spoke the word. A curl of cedar scent said a mountain range many days away. A flake of gold caught in a weaver's hair said someone had told a good story near the loom. Scribes copied loanwords into lists, amused and pleased by the way new sounds fit into old patterns like fresh bricks laid along a familiar course. The assembly of the Anunnaki, which had always loved lists, seemed to approve when a city admitted that knowledge, too, travels in caravans. Night on the road made its own temple. A ring of sleeping animals, a circle of faces held in lamplight, stars busy with their gentle keeping. A guard sat awake and worse than bored, boredom being, in such work, a kind of blessing, listening for the difference between wind and foot, between fox and man, between trouble and the mind making trouble. He stroked a rope into smoothness and thought of home, the way the courtyard held coolness in its bricks, the smell of bread that knew when to be done, the soft scrape of his child's stylus on a practice tablet. Distance, properly arranged, makes home brighter without making the road dimmer. Back in the city, that home received the road, storerooms arranged by route, jars stacked by river, bolts of cloth tied and labelled with the name of the district where the sheep had grazed. In ledgers, debts and credits met and shook hands. In kitchens, spices touched stews that tasted like a polite conversation between places. In temples, a portion of first arrivals was offered, not because the gods ate, but because gratitude is a weight that sits best when set down in a known place. The Anunnaki, named softly, were thanked for returns, that most human of miracles. Even stories travelled as cargo. A sailor brought a rumour of a great fish that glowed at night. A caravaner swore that in a far city, the moon was counted differently and yet the fields prospered. A pilgrim retold, for the 10th time and thus the best time, the tale of a king who listened to a poor man's dream and found a solution there. These were not told to ignite the blood. They were told to steady it. They reassured listeners that the world, even as it widens, keeps a recognizable shape. If you are listening now with the kind fatigue that follows a day of errands, let the road lengthen and soften in your mind. See the river turn like a careful wrist pouring water into a jar. See the caravan string itself across a small ridge. Hear the market scale meet itself in the middle. Imagine a seal rolling a crisp image into wet clay. Imagine fingers pausing a heartbeat to admire it before the work continues. Imagine the long, kind itinerary: depart, cross, camp, bargain, return, lift, tally, seal, store, rest. The Anunnaki stand at no tollgate to bar your way. They sit in the book of weights and nod when the sum agrees. Among the old stories that move like deep currents beneath Mesopotamia, there is one that returns whenever the river rises too fast, whenever a season forgets itself. Whenever people need to be reminded that endings and beginnings often wear the same face. We call it a flood, a word that can sound like shouting, but in the tablets, even this is told with the patience of scribes and the caution of priests. The Anunnaki are present as always, not as lightning hurled from heights, but as the solemn council that wrestles with balance. Too much noise in the world. Too many disruptions in the careful weave. Too much heat in the breath of men. A decision gathers like cloud. And then another decision, quieter, begins to form underneath it the Atrahasis tail, and in cousins of that tail remembered by other cities, other tongues, the world's order has frayed. The young gods once rebelled under heavy work. Humans were made to share the load. Now humans have filled the days with a new kind of clamour, not the simple sounds of markets or songs, but the press of carelessness that spoils the scale, that forgets the practice of pauses. The Anunnaki consider a bending of the world back toward quiet. It is Enlil's severity that the tablets often emphasize. He, guardian of breath and rule, leans toward reset. But the stories refuse simple oppositions. Within the same assembly sits Enki, whose mind moves like water finding a better path, whose wisdom favors humane adjustments over large corrections. The council's decision becomes a flood. Enki's decision becomes a warning that he does not shout the warning. Shouting would be a contradiction of the remedy. He whispers to a wall, to a reed hut, to a surface that knows how to carry small vibrations the way riverbanks carry the voice of current. Reed hut, the council begins, as old and soft as the sound you hear when you press your ear to a woven mat and listen to your own blood. The message is for a man, Atrahasis in one telling, Utnapishtim in another, a man whose competence is a kind of piety. Build a boat, says the whisper. Measure it by what you have learned from your city, length like a street, breadth like a courtyard, height like the stacked beds of storehouses. Seal its seams with bitumen the colour of night. Bring aboard seeds and measures and beasts and the small, necessary tools by which life turns quietly. To build a boat is not to panic. It is to organize. Atrahasis consults his ledgers. He marks what must be carried that cannot be found elsewhere later. He thinks of children's habits, of the way a basket fails when its fourth reed is cracked, of how oil must be covered even in the dark. He does what the edubba taught. He makes lists. Not just animals in pairs, but tasks in pairs. Who will bank the lamp during the night watch? Who will check the lashings at dawn? The people around him laugh a little, the way people always laugh gently at anyone who prepares before the rain shows its face. He answers no one with speeches. He works, the boat rises, plank by plank. Men who had once mended reed boats for market days now bind curves that will carry a small city. Women who can taste by smell whether beer needs another hour to settle now judge the temper of bitumen by the way it clings to a finger. A boy carries pegs in a sling. A girl inventories jars with a stylus that has learned how to count without anxiety. The whisper in the reed wall becomes a habit in their hands. The Anunnaki are not invoked every moment, but the pattern that pleases them, the one of measure and care, fills the air like the memory of incense. When the first slow rains come, they do not yet scold. They set a texture on clay, a sheen on the boat's flank, a weight in rope that causes someone to retire and knot more carefully. Then rain comes with insistence. The river remembers old boundaries and goes to visit them. Canals overflow as if to greet cousins. Fields go quiet beneath a moving skin. People climb steps they had built for festivals and now discover are good for leaving. Atrahasis closes the last clasp. His boat is not a miracle. It is a very good room with a lid, a room that has taught itself to float. Inside, the boat sounds like a house after supper. Small voices, small clinking, the soft redistribution of weight as sleepers turn. There is a schedule for lamps. There is a little ledger for oil. There is humor about the goat who puts his chin where it never belongs. There are prayers, but they sound like instructions. Shut the door gently, cover the jar, run your hand along the seam and feel for wetness. Outside, the whole world tries on the shape of sea, as if to try on forgetfulness. Inside, memory curls itself around loaves and tools, around names and promises, and holds on by being particular. The flood stories do not hurry through water. Days lengthen into an interval. The boat makes a music of creaks and pats and 1,000 small checkings. Those aboard learn a new measure, not sunrise and market, not priest hour and school hour, but the time it takes for grain to soak, the way a cup fills when the boat tilts this way and that, the count of breaths between thunder steps. The Anunnaki's judgment, harsh in one telling, qualified by compassion in another, is felt here not as anger but as the weight of rebalancing. Enki visits in dreams, not to dazzle but to suggest little improvements. A tray moved from here to there. A space kept clear near the door. A reminder to keep song alive, softly, not to stir panic but to replace it. Eventually, the rain steps back. The boat comes to rest, on a mount in some tellings, on a shoal in others, on anything that feels more still than yesterday. The door opens the way a tired chest opens after a long sigh. Light enters not as a blaze but as familiar day, broken over water into little coins. Atrahasis sends out a bird, one that returns, then another that does not. The gesture is not cleverness for its own sake. It is a test as old as bread rising. Wait, look, try, wait again. If there is land, it will show itself without being dragged into the story by impatience. When feet finally find ground, the first acts are the acts of thanks and tidy. The decks are swept. Ropes are coiled. Jars are checked. A small offering, bread and a pinch of something sweet, is burned in a fire that struggles with damp. Its smoke rises like a thin hand. The Anunnaki, who are said to have been hungry for offerings throughout the flood, are restored to their ceremonial appetites. But the deeper restoration is in the pattern, the return of the sequence that gives people back their shape. Water where it belongs, land where it belongs, tools where they belong, promises re-spoken.in some versions. The assembly recognizes Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim, with a gift that is barely a gift, length of days. The quiet of a life lived beyond the usual measure. He is placed at the edge of things, where he can become a story and not a disruption, where he can oversee his garden and learn again the pace of ordinary weather. In others, no exceptional reward is named. The reward is the world, available again in its many small tasks. In either case, the lesson is gentle and exact. Survival is not a crown. It is a craft practiced before the waters rise and continued after they fall. The flood is remembered in liturgy but even more in architecture. Door sills are set a little higher. Drains are cut a little deeper. Storehouses gain a second shelf. Tablets note a new rule about how much grain must be kept against long rain. Children repeat the story in a tone that does not love fear. They love the part where a wall could listen, where a reed could carry advice, where a boat could be the size of a neighborhood and taste of sesame smoke. They love the bird that comes back with green news in its beak. They love how their grandparents nod at the details. Bitumen properly heated, pegs seated square. Animals calmed with a cloth over their eyes during the roughest swell. Priests read the tale at New Year. Not as a threat but as a meter by which the city tunes itself at the year's beginning. Sweep channels. Mend stairs, check ledgers. Remind judges that mercy and math are not enemies. Remind bakers that yeast is a kind of memory. Remind everyone that noise without purpose is tiring for gods and men. The Anunnaki are praised, and Enki, who speaks to things that can carry a whisper, is thanked for preferring repair to spectacle, and if a year passes without flood, no one says the story is out of date. A household uses it to remember what lasts. Warnings that come in small voices, preparations that look like everyday work, boats that are rooms made faithful. If sap rises surprisingly early in the orchard, someone smiles and says the Anunnaki have adjusted the clock. If a canal cuts a new mouth after a hard winter, someone else says the assembly is counting more carefully this year. Neither statement is doctrine. Both are courtesies extended to a world that has made room again for people to move at human speed. If you are listening now with a little weather of your own pressing at the threshold, tasks that have swollen, thoughts that have overflowed, let the flood story become not alarm but a method. Whisper to your reed hut, the part of you that is light and woven and ready to carry information along its length. Make a list. Choose a boat, which is to say, choose a room that can float, a desk that can be cleared, a bed that can be trusted, a kitchen that can boil water and make it sweet with leaves. Seal the seams that need sealing. Ask help from the kind voice inside you that always sounds like water finding a kinder channel. Then, when the weather eases, step outside, sweep, place things where they belong, and burn a small offering, a candle, a word, a minute of stillness. If kingship was the city's posture and trade its reach, then healing was its listening, the way a people incline themselves toward pain without panic, toward weakness without disdain. In Mesopotamia, illness was not an enemy to be vanquished with noise. It was a disruption of pattern to be coaxed back into place with attention, with hands that knew textures, with words that had learned how to speak softly to fear. The Anunnaki, who kept the world's intervals and measures, were imagined here as patrons of return, presences that nodded whenever a fever cooled by degrees or a child's breath regained a rhythm that would carry her through the night. A T first light. The Ipu, the exorcist healer, stepped into a courtyard that had been sprinkled with clean water before dawn. He carried a bundle of reeds, a small jar of oil, and a satchel of tablets whose surfaces were smoothed by years of reading aloud. The Asu, the physician, came later with mortar and pestle, with bundles of herbs tied in pairs, with strips of linen cut by a careful hand the night before. They were not rivals. One listened to the world's spirit, the other to the world's body. Together they listened for the return of balance. A patient lay on a woven mat near the wall where shade held longer. The night had been restless, fever stepping in and out like an uninvited guest who cannot decide whether to stay. The mother had counted breaths, not to worry them into submission but to know them, to have a number that could be handed to the morning like a small, important parcel. The Ipu sat, not looming, and asked for signs the way a scribe might ask for numbers. When did the heat begin? Did the sweat smell of bitterness? Did dreams carry a certain color? He wetted a reed and traced a circle on the ground, not to trap anything, but to mark a space of attention. He murmured names, Anu, Enlil, Enki, one per breath. Not to summon thunder, but to sequence the room into calm. The Asu crushed willow bark and poplar leaves, added honey that a neighbor had brought at first light, mixed with water to a thickness that would not run. He warmed a little oil until it shone like a patient eye, then dripped 3 drops into the mix with a pause after each, as if he were counting out the beats of a song. He did not explain the plants the way modern men explain. He handled them the way a potter handles clay, with respect, with memory, with the sense that each has a temperament that asks to be met and not bullied. The Anunnaki were invoked here not as miracle workers but as witnesses to the work of hands that remember. On a shelf near the doorway. Tablets listed remedies and omens in pairs. If the fever leaves in the second night, give barley broth and rest. If the cough rattles without phlegm, rub the chest with heated oil and cedar. If the eye smart, steep asafoetida with water of dates. And beside each, a note. Say this line, an incantation that did not threaten the illness but reminded the body of its pattern. The words sounded like instructions given to an apprentice. You know your shape. Return to it. The city had learned that a sentence, repeated softly, can be an instrument, like a scale or a measuring rod, bringing a thing back to its proper length. In the temple of Gula, the goddess of healing, dogs slept in courtyards. Their presence both practical and symbolic. Patients brought small clay figures of dogs as offerings and set them in neat rows along a wall, each a prayer you could touch. Priests kept the walkway swept, the basins full, the lamps trimmed so their smoke would not irritate tender lungs. An attendant, sometimes a man, sometimes a woman with hands like cool cloth, led the family to a quiet room where shelves held jars labeled with signs precise enough that even a trembling hand could find the right one. The smells were gentle: sesame oil, warmed plaster, crushed mint, bitumen in its civilized form, tamed and persuaded to seal what ought not to leak. Diagnosis here was not a shout of certainty. It was a conversation with time. The Ipu watched the shadow a wrist cast at midday to guess the heat's stubbornness. The Asu listened to how a cough unfolded, 1 note, then 2, then the silence afterward that told whether the chest was ready to receive a poultice or needed steam. They did not war with the body. They asked it. When the poultice was ready, the linen strips were laid with care, neither tight nor slack, the knots placed where a sleeping person would not roll onto them. A bowl of water sat nearby, a reed laid across it so the patient's eye could rest on the straight line when vision swam. There were midwives, too, whose science had learned to become almost invisible. They counted months with string knotted at intervals, listened with palms, and knew by the tilt of a woman's breath how far a pain had yet to travel. They heated water, not for spectacle but for use. They set stools just so. They bound hair back. They spoke in sentences that held a room together like a net. When a child slipped into air, the midwife caught without flinching and set without fuss. The first cry was a seal rolled across the wet clay of the moment, leaving an image that would be admired for years. Offerings were small, a handful of dates, a bracelet woven from thread, but they were given with the satisfaction of a pattern decently kept. Not all illness bent easily. There were lingerings that taught humility, joints that stiffened despite warm oil, bellies that soured though mint had been chewed, eyes that clouded like slow weather. In such cases, the healers did not turn cruel or loud. They shrunk the circle of the task to what could be done well: comfort a hand, ease a breath, let a person sleep with a back supported by a rolled mat placed by someone who had learned how to play such things. The Anunnaki, imagined as judges of the underworld, were, in sick rooms, imagined as gentle recorders. They took note of kindness with the same accuracy they applied to measures of grain. Sometimes omens presented themselves, an odd bird at the window, a cup that cracked along a neat diagonal, a dream that repeated like a wave. The Ipu made a list, not to fetishize the signs but to remove their sting by arranging them. If there was meat to be tested by liverix dispacy, it was done with gravity and modesty, not as a show for anxious minds but as a way to ask the world a question politely. The answers, when they came, were folded into care plans: more rest this month, a postponement of travel, a vow to the temple kitchen to supply 2 baskets of flour when the fever granted leave to bake again in the workshop of the Asu. Shelves held little universes: dried licorice root, coriander, mustard seed, juniper berries, cumin, onion, and garlic plaited like stories. Resins kept in pots to be warmed and softened into plasters that knew how to cling. A pestle's rhythm was as soothing as a lullaby. He ground, he sifted, he mixed, he tested the scent with eyes closed the way a scribe tests a line's straightness with his fingers. Bottles were stoppered with cork and sealed with strips of clay rolled with the healer's own seal, a dog and a star, which meant any tampering would speak for itself before a worse harm could be done. There were hospice rooms, the phrase is newer than the practice, where the goal shifted openly from cure to comfort. The lamps were set lower. The wicks were trimmed more often. The mats were thicker. The door was taught to close without complaint. The Ipu's voice became even smaller, naming the Anunnaki in a meter so familiar that the names themselves ceased to matter and only the spacing mattered. The gentle pauses between, space to breathe in, space to breathe out. The Asu's hands became slower and warmer. A relative was guided to place a palm in a certain place on a wrist, to match breath, to count not numbers but steadiness. When death came, it came into a room with order, and in such rooms grief can move without knocking things over. Children learned healing the way they learned everything in Mesopotamia, by watching, by repeating, by placing small things well. A boy practiced winding linen around a reed until the strip lay flat. A girl learned to heat water to just the right point by watching the first small bubbles hesitate at the edge of a pot. They memorized short lists: 3 herbs for stomach, 3 for cough, 3 for a bitten hand. They were told that no remedy worked without rest, and no rest held without cleanliness, and no cleanliness endured without habit, and habit was the true god of healing. Second only to time.in, the temple's archive. Tablets recorded cases that would sound familiar across millennia: man of 30 with pain of side, warmed oil, willow, rest, improved on the 4th day, woman with difficulty of sleep, tears many, incense of juniper at dusk, words spoken at length by elder sister, sleep returned on the 7th night, child with fear dreams, dog figurine given, Story of brave fisherman told for 9 nights. Bad dreams reduced. Appetite restored. These were not miracles. They were minutes of meetings between care and need. The Anunnaki signatures are invisible on such tablets. But anyone who has watched a fever break knows how to read them, sometimes. Healing required building, a ramp for an older man who no longer trusted stairs. A bench in a courtyard that caught morning sun for a woman whose cough eased in warmth. A small niche for a lamp that could burn through a night without being jostled. Carpenters and masons became doctors with wood and brick. Neighbors became nurses by staying until the second lamp burned low. The city treated these constructions as offerings. A scribe came to write a line, to Gula for the easing of a back, to the Anunnaki for the return of breath. If tablets taught the city to think in lines and canals taught it to breathe in measures, looms taught it to listen, to feel how patience gathers into strength one thread at a time. In Mesopotamia, cloth was not a luxury that flashed and vanished. It was a continuity. Households and temples made it the way they made bread, with hands that knew where to begin, how to keep a rhythm, and when to pause so that tension could settle back into kindness. The Anunnaki, guardians of order, were present here as a tactile law, warp straight, weft steady, edges honest, arrangements so simple that a child could learn them, so generous that a civilization could wear them before dawn. A courtyard lamp made a small lake of light. A warp-weighted loom stood against a plastered wall, its vertical strings already combed into a gentle waterfall by last night's hands. Stones wrapped in clay hung at the ends to keep the warp in a thoughtful pull, not demanding, not slack. A woman, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, checked each cord with forefinger and thumb, reading tightness the way a scribe reads spacing, a silent proofreading. Nearby, a basket held spindles with fresh-plied yarn of sheep's wool, white as unbaked bread. Another basket kept coarser thread for selvages. Because borders must be faithful if the middle is to rest. The work began with a kiss of sound, the heddle lifted. Weft passed through, batten pressed, the loom answering with a low wooden hum. First inches are always the hardest, a fabric's personality declared in tiny choices about beat and breath. A neighbor poured water into a bowl so the air would not grow too dry. Another trimmed the lamp wick before smoke could kiss the cloth. The world's gentlest choreography returned. Lift, pass, press, pause. The Anunnaki were not named out loud every hour. They were assumed in the evenness, as a good road is assumed beneath a cart that does not rattle. Long before these moments, a shepherd had composed the wool. On river meadows, sheep carried the weather in their coats, dust of floodwork, perfume of reeds, sun made soft by lanolin. Hands had washed the fleeces in canal edges, carded them with combs that rasped like a cricket choir, teased them into rolags that the spindle turned into rope-fine consistency. To spin is to befriend time. Twist gathered on the thigh, fibre offered from the hand, spindle set free to fall and catch in a measured dance. At day's end, skeins hung from a beam like notes on a stave, the courtyard smelling faintly of wet wool and ash, while a child counted loops the way he counted stars. Dye brought the quiet drama. Pots simmered, madder for reds that could warm a winter room, woad and indigo in distant stories but softer blues near a home, achieved with plant ash and patient experiment. Saffron and pomegranate rhined for golds that remembered harvest. Walnut for browns that made other colors sit up straight. A dyer's craft was not a loud boast. It was a memory palace of water temperatures and mordants, of when to stir and when to leave the pot alone. She tested a thread at the lip, not with words but with the way it held color when pinched and rinsed. A skein that came out honest, neither shouting nor sulking, was hung in shade, because shade is the guardian of truth in color.in temple workshops. The same patience expanded into an economy. Scribes tallied fleeces in, skeins out, finished lengths delivered to storerooms, rations for weavers measured not stingily but exactly. The workshop master, who had once been all hands and now was mostly eyes, walked the rows and made small corrections with a fingertip. Beat gentler, he might murmur, and the cloth immediately remembered it was meant to drape, not to resist. The selvage, those edge cords doubled and tied, was the subject of loving scrutiny. A good selvage is a promise. This fabric will not unravel when the season turns or when a child tugs. Patterns arrive from practice before they arrived from ambition. A single bar of color to mark the middle. A narrow ladder of darkened light near the border. A small repeat that could be counted with the breath. 1, 2, 3, change. 1, 2, 3, change. Later, when trade braided languages and spices across the land, motifs traveled with them. Little step diamonds, a river line that meandered, a field of dots like barley scattered by a playful hand. Cloth learned to speak quietly of elsewhere while remaining loyal to the body it warmed. Weaving did not stay in workshops. It lived in homes. In one courtyard, a mother worked while a toddler discovered the pleasure of soft things. Wool against cheek, wool against floor. In another, a grandmother unpicked an old hem to reuse the good length, smoothing it with a wet palm the way a scribe smooths clay. Mending was a virtue praised without speeches. A careful darning stitch restored not just yarn but confidence that nothing precious ends quickly. In a city that counted carefully, mending is a theology. Renewal is more accurate than replacement. Cloth dressed statues as surely as people. In shrines, priests folded textiles over shoulders of gods with hands that remembered births and funerals. No crease falling carelessly, every tie symmetrical. Inventories spoke a tender ledger of faith. One mantle of washed wool. 2 stoles with border of barley stitch. A veil dyed with pomegranate rind. When an old garment was retired, it was not dismissed. It was folded into cedar and kept against a day when a festival wanted the smell of memory. Markets breathed through piles of textiles as through lungs. Bolts leaned against tent poles like friendly pillars. A weaver unfurled a length not with flourish but with a slow laydown, inviting the buyer's hands to do the talking. The scale weighed wool by the handful. The eye weighed drape by the way cloth flowed over the arm. A scribe wrote a receipt on a tablet still soft as bread, adding the dyer sign and the workshop's mark so that months later someone could trace the lineage of a garment the way one traces a story source. Beyond clothing, cloth became infrastructure. Ship cords wrapped in protection. Basket rims bound against time. Roof edges tied down against surprise winds. Sails stitched from panels learned the language of breath so that boats could speak to rivers more efficiently. A physician tore strips for bandages with a neat gesture. A midwife wiped a brow with linen kept in a jar for just that comfort. Cloth-lined cradles, swaddled jars to prevent chipping, curtained doorways so words could soften before entering rooms. In the archive, precious tablets were swaddled in scraps, because even memory likes a gentle lining. Training new hands was a festival of small triumphs. A child's first even row was celebrated like a first steady word. The loom answered a mistake with a visible scar that everyone learned to love, then to avoid repeating. Teachers taught quiet diagnostics. If the middle draws in, the selvages need feeding. If the weft ripples, your beat has grown impatient. If the shed narrows, check the weights. If your shoulders ache, rest before the cloth remembers your tension and keeps it. The Anunnaki's lesson, ever the same. Pattern is kinder than force. Cloth also accounted for seasons. In the month when dust makes eyebrows pale, weavers chose sturdy weft for floor mats. In the month of cool winds, they prepared thicker blankets for newborns. In the month when river light looks like polished copper, dyers favored walnut and madder, colors that agree with sunlight. A city that wears its seasons well keeps illness and ill temper at a distance. This the elders said, and the cloth proved them right that if a king wanted to boast, he did so as a weaver boasts. He counted. So many lengths for the temple. So many mantles for the crews that dredged the canal. So many veils for the festival of first fruits. Even excess had to pass through looms. Ambition trimmed into threads that could be made coherent. In victory processions, banners remembered weavers more than warriors, for a banner's courage is in its steadiness over distance. Its refusal to fray in crosswinds. A T-day's end, the loom rested. Weights tapped each other lightly like sheep settling. The last weft of the day lay across the warp with a feeling of sentence completed. A cover cloth descended to keep dust respectful. Hands rubbed sesame oil into the batten to preserve its temper. The room smelled of lanolin, smoke, and near silence. Families touched the growing fabric the way one touches a sleeping child's hair. to believe in tomorrow cloth. Once off the loom, is finished the way stories are finished, washed, beaten softly on clean stones to teach it to agree with itself, hung where breezes speak politely, folded into rectangles that calm the eye. A corner is lifted to a face, cool, then warm, then simply home. Gifts are wrapped in it. Debts are settled with it. Vows are tied with it. Grieving is made bearable by it. Love is stated in it without any need for words. There are tablets that list ration issues for weavers, wages in barley and oil. Song lists to keep the rhythm straight, invocations to Utu, goddess of weaving, a thread of divinity braided into human skill. But the softest records are invisible, a warp remembered by hands, a tension learned by shoulder and breath, a pattern that feels right in the body before it is counted by the mind. In such memories, the Anunnaki dwell most comfortably. They approve of cities that clothe themselves not in spectacle but in reliability. If the ziggurat taught the city how to stand in public, the courtyard house taught it how to rest in private. Mesopotamian homes were not fortresses, nor were they theatre. They were containers for climate and kin, shaped by sun, wind, and the gentle demands of daily life. In their walls of mud brick and their rooms arranged around light, you can hear the city's quietest conviction: comfort is a craft. The Anunnaki, keepers of order, were present here not as statues but as good proportions, clean thresholds, and habits that made small spaces generous. Begin outside, where the lane is narrow and shade is its own currency. Walls meet the street with few windows, their faces combed smooth with a wet trowel. A door, thick wood bound with fibre, sits a little above the ground on a threshold stone, not to impress but to dodge rain and drifting dust. A clay pipe slips under the sill so a watcher can hear voices before footsteps appear. A reed mat hangs within, ready to be drawn for modesty. The latch closes with a softened click that the house learns like a child learns a lullaby. Step in and the street drops away. The courtyard opens not into spectacle but into breath, a square of sky, a floor of packed earth tamped to the firmness of memory, a low basin for washing, a jar where water keeps its temper, a fig or date palm if the plan allowed a growth of shade. Along the courtyard's edges, rooms stand with small doorways and thick walls. Their strength is in their thermal patience. Mud brick, sun-dried, straw-tempered, holds the days cool like a good story holds attention without hurrying. In heat, interiors are a note lower. In chill, they rise a note warmer. The roof is a teaching. Beams of palm or poplar laid shoulder to shoulder across walls, reeds laid over them, then clay spread and burnished to shed rain with a shrug. Each spring, family and neighbours climb to replaster, kneading clay with straw, singing the old climbing song whose rhythm keeps ankles safe on ladders. A shallow parapet makes the roof a summer room. Mats unrolled at night, a low stool, a jar, the sky turning itself like a great quiet wheel. Children learn the boundaries with their shins and then respect them with ease. Rooms are named by function more than furniture. One along the north for sleeping when winds are southerly. One with a small built oven, a beehive dome of clay, for baking and stewing. One that keeps tools and jars and the small embarrassments of a household. A corner for weaving with a spindle basket and a loom leaning between errands. A niche set into a wall for a lamp and a pinch of salt. Floors are smooth clay sprinkled lightly and swept in circles. Mats are geometry you can roll and carry to wherever shade decides to live that hour. Light comes down from the sky hole and sideways from doorways, clean and rationed. Lamps, small, palmable, throw a disciplined light at dusk. Their wicks, trimmed the way temple wicks are trimmed, burn with a steady, unjudging flame. Smoke is taught its lane by a little practice. A window cracked, a reed fan, the knowledge of how to bank embers before sleep. Smell is a kind of architecture. Bread as morning wall, sesame oil as evening curtain, juniper in winter as a roof you can feel under the ribs. Water is the house's covenant with itself. A jar stands always near the courtyard, cool clay sweating the way a forehead does after work. A shallow gutter, plastered smooth, guides rain to a corner cistern, covered to deny insects and mischief. Hands learn the sequence: draw water, replace the lid, wipe the lip, set the ladle down in its place. This sequence pleases the gods not because they thirst, but because order relieves the mind. Listen for the oven's rhythm. At dawn, a mother slaps rounds of dough to the inner wall. They cling, then brown, then release with a practiced peel. The sound is a timbre the house knows. Thup, hush, thup, hush. A pot settles into a ring of coals, its lid weighted by a stone that lived another life as a child's hand toy. The menu is not loud. Barley stewed with herbs, lentils with onion, dates softened in warm water. A pinch of salt the size of a patient fingernail. A drizzle of oil saved from the careful ration the temple steward recorded last moon. The Anunnaki smile nowhere more certainly than in a pot that doesn't scorch. The bed is a lesson in humility and precision. Woven cords, a frame of wood, a rolled bolster, a folded cloth that knows the backs it welcomes. At noon in summer, beds move to where the air moves. At midnight they retreat to where the stars watch. Children own corners and claim them with objects. A clay whistle, a smooth sherd of blue glaze, a sling, a stylus broken to the right size for fidgeting. Adults own tasks and claim them with tools. A knife wrapped in cloth, a needle in a reed case, a ledger shard that holds 3 numbers like a private oath. Privacy is not walls alone. It is courtesy. A guest is given the cool side of the courtyard and the breezeward chair. Talk is pitched to the room's volume, not to an idea of importance. A curtain declares a woman's workroom hers without solemnity. When grief visits, neighbors arrive as repairs arrive. Quiet, regular, bringing bread and the knowledge of where the house keeps its cups. When joy arrives, sweets are fried, the courtyard swept twice. And a bowl of water is poured into dust so dancing will not raise it into eyes. Yes, there are drains, low and practical, plastered with care, leading gently to the lane where they can be carried away. Yes, they're pests, and households learn the grammar of discouragement. Baskets with tight lids, cords rubbed with bitter oil, cracks filled with plaster that has been persuaded to behave. Yes, there is noise sometimes, but the house knows how to absorb it with mats and habits and the small authority of predictable days to the doorframe. A mark, cylinder seal pressed into wet plaster the year the house was completed, reminds the family that homes, like contracts, are agreements renewed by use. At the inner niche, a palm-sized figurine, a goddess of weaving, a dog of Gula, a star scratched by a child's careful hand, collects the day's spare gratitude, a crumb, a drop, a whispered line. The Anunnaki do not require drama from a house. They require alignment, that stairs be safe, that doors not bite, that thresholds register the comings and goings without insisting on their own importance. Construction is a festival disguised as work. Bricks are molded in rows, dried on the lane's edge, turned, stacked, handed up. Mud slaps to wall, fingers comb it smooth. A boy draws a straight line with a taut string that sings when plucked. When the roof is finally laid, bread is broken on it, a thread is tied at the corner, and the first night is slept there under open certainty. Later, repairs feel like the continuation of that first act. Roof patched, lintel rubbed with oil, oven lip mended with a smoother ARC.I in winter, the courtyard shrinks to a leaner shape. Rooms do more. A brazier learns to give heat without smoke. A pot of herbs hangs where hands can brush it and remind noses that spring is a thing toward which houses travel. In summer, the house opens, lids off jars, curtains lifted, parapet hosting sleep beneath a sky that lists its familiar constellations, the plough, the old man, the swallow. Dreams arrange themselves in lines as neat as stored pots. Visitors from far places notice how low Mesopotamian furniture sits, how supple the postures are, how the house asks bodies to be near to floor and water and one another. Where are your chairs? Someone once joked in a trader's tale, and the old woman of the house patted the mat. Here are plenty. Later, the visitor understood. Comfort in these rooms is measured not in height but in ease of rearrangement. A mat pulls back and a game is on. A mat slides forward and supper is set. Children learn housekeeping the way they learn writing, by lists and touch. Sweep corners inward, always. Wash bowls in the sequence older to younger. Leave a thumbprint in the new plaster to remind it you are watching. Put the fire out last. Check the roof after wind. Tuck the jar's lid under the same coil of reed every time. These rules are not heavy. They keep choice available for things that deserve it. Song, story, the timing of ANAP.AT night. The house becomes a boat without moving. The door latched, the lamp a star. The family arranged in a geometry learned from years of weather. Somewhere a donkey brays at nothing. Somewhere a watchman's staff touches stone with the regularity of a clock that does not need hands. A child, between waking and sleep, counts the holes in a palm mat and loses number at 12. A mother folds tomorrow's bread cloth. A father rubs a nick in a bowl until the bowl and the worry both smooth. When rain comes, fat and rare, it strikes the roof like counsel tapping a shoulder. Drips appear where time has shifted a seam. Pots are placed, jokes are made. The ladder is set for the clearing as soon as clouds walk on. Afterward, the smell of clay darkened is like forgiveness. The house sighs and brightens at once. The threshold stone keeps shining. If you could read the ledger of a single day in such a home, it would not astonish you. It would soothe, open, sweep, draw, stir, share, mend, bank, close. The Anunnaki's presence is a sequence written in space. Court to room, room to roof, roof to court, the breath of a family taught to turn as reliably as the city's great calendar. Nothing is dramatic. Everything matters. If the ziggurat was a stairway to the sky, the field was a page on which the city wrote its daily poem, line by patient line, furrow by furrow. Mesopotamia learned early that divinity is clearest where water meets earth in measured conversation. The Anunnaki, guardians of order, were felt here as leveled ground, straight channels, gates that open and close on time, and hands that know when to loosen and when to hold. In the hush of dawn over barley and date palm, law became irrigation, prayer became routine, and prosperity became nothing louder than a well-set sluice before light had fully decided itself. Canal wardens walked the embankments with poles that knew the weight of silt. A cool skin of mist lay over water, and reeds made their soft papery talk whenever a breeze asked them a question. The warden's stick tapped the clay where last year's flood had chewed, listened, and answered, repair here, not there. Trim this lip. Smooth that seam. Children, apprentices of mud and measure, followed with baskets, learning how to patch a leak so the patch would hold not only today but through the week of first winds. Nothing rushed. A canal does not love haste. It loves attention. Fields had their own grammar. A good field began with a level that did not lie. Men bent to sight along a stretched cord, watching the tiny sag in its center as if it were a shy god whose face must be read properly. A boy held a plumb bob that winked in dawn light. The first pass of the plough was not a conquest. It was a sentence starter. Oxen leaned into their work, hide smelling of dust and warm breath, while a driver murmured sounds older than words, syllables that kept pace and kindness together. The soil turned with the resigned pleasure of a long stiff shoulder at last set right. Barley was the great citizen, humble, durable, forgiving of salt the river sometimes left behind, patient with heat that could make more delicate grains sulk. Its seed lay like punctuation in prepared lines. A sower's hand learned distance by feel, a scatter that would read as plenty when green rose, not so thick that each plant elbowed the next for water. Behind the sower, a rake drew a thin veil of earth, a polite covering, nothing heavy. In the city, a scribe might write issuance of barley rations with a wedge and a flick. Out here, the same wedge and flick were performed by hand and tool upon ground. Between fields and city, date palms posted themselves like pillars in a courtyard. They held the memory of water high in the air, green hands that shaded, trunks that stored. Beneath them, the air was cooler. Beneath them, gardens of onion, leek, cucumber, and melons made a second harvest of shade. Palm caretakers climbed with ropes around their waists and ankles, pressing dusty feet against the bark's chevron grip, pausing to breathe at intervals the tree had set long before any calendar. Dates were shaken down in calm brown rain into woven mats. The sound of their landing was the sound of wealth without noise, water moved by permission. Gates, simple boards and pegs, clever slides of wood and reed, let a measured share into each furrow. The waterman's eye counted width and slope, His thumb measured time. "Enough," he would say, and lift the board with a grunt that ended in a smile. Further along, another gate waited its turn. To steal water was a kind of profanity. To take less than your share was a kind of worry. To take exactly your share was the daily liturgy that kept neighbors neighbors. The Anunnaki were invoked at such gates the way a judge is invoked at a scale, not to frighten, but to remind. When the wind changed, everyone heard it. The reeds altered their sentence. Leaves told the story differently. That was the signal to adjust. More shade for the kitchen plots. Looser soil around a row that had caked. A small break in a furrow lip to ease a pooling that would sour roots. Farmers spoke less and looked more. Their seeing saved them as surely as any prayer. A cloud bank on the far horizon meant an extra hand to the gate that always swelled first. A river smell saltier than usual meant barley's patience would be tested, and gypsum might be spread later to sweeten ground. Tablets in the edubba had taught the signs. The skin and the nose confirmed them. At noon, the field was not abandoned. It was tended differently. Work retreated to the shade of a palm or the lee of a threshing floor wall. Bread came out of cloth, dates out of their basket with skins wrinkled just enough. A little jar of beer lifted and sipped slowly, not to chase thirst but to partner with it. A boy counted the loops of his sling. A girl plucked a blade of barley and drew it through her teeth, tasting what would be tasted in bread months later. The canal continued to talk politely against its bank. A dragonfly wrote a brief letter to the surface and left no trace. Later, weeding took the same patience as prayer. Fingers learned to discriminate between what the city loved and what the city could not afford. Weeds come with water as stories come with markets. Some are welcome. Some must be guided elsewhere. A woman, talking gently to her daughter, taught the trick: pull with a roll, not a jerk. Shake the dust loose so the field keeps what it needs. Lay the weeds away from the furrow so water won't carry them to a fresh seat. The day lengthened without drama. The Anunnaki's favor looked like nothing going wrong. The tea season's turn. Reaping began. Sickles with inlays of flint kissed the stalks, a clean whisper that multiplied into a kind of music. Stubble remained neat, respectful. Armfuls were gathered and bound. Sheaves leaned like guests against a wall, waiting to be invited to the floor where they would tell their grain. Threshing was a soft patience, oxen circling, hooves careful, a sledge whose underside bit just enough to loosen, not enough to waste. A boy tossed with a fork into a breeze that knew its job, grain falling heavy, chaff lifting, the afternoon becoming clear by degrees. The granary was a temple whose god was dryness. Floors packed and plastered, walls thick, roofs tight. Jars waited with their mouths trained to shut. A steward crumbled a handful between finger and thumb and nodded when the grain did not cling. A scribe wrote numbers in lines that did not drift. Seals bit into strips of clay that bound stoppers, not as decoration but as the city's promise to itself. What was measured would remain measured. When the store hummed with quiet consequence, elders felt lighter in their backs. Winter could come. The Anunnaki had witnessed the sequence. They would watch over its return. Between sowing and harvest lived the gardens, the domestic plots that kept variety alive. Garlic hung like white bells in shade. Mustard sprouted from cracks with cheerful insolence. Coriander feathery and fragrant, mint like a small, polite flood. Children were assigned rows and took pride in them. A child who watered too fast learned from a scolded plant that life is not impressed by hurry. A child who remembered to check for beetles in the cool hours wore the approval of the evening stew in her eyes. Ritual folded itself into fieldwork without creak. When the new moon tilted into a tight crescent, water schedule shifted. When the full moon took its place at the top of the night, a little offering of bread and beer was left at the gate's hinge with a touch of oil, not because the hinge eats, but because hinges deserve courtesy. At Akatu and other festivals, the first cut sheaves were walked through streets so city and field could remember they were each other's lungs. The grain did not bow. It swayed, disputes happened. Humans are not reeds. A furrow cut too eagerly into a neighbor's quota. A gate left open a shade too long. The judge might visit in sandals dusty with field dust, not court dust, and hear the tone of voices as much as their text. He would look where water had laid its proof, draw a line with his staff, and speak in a voice that had learned how to end a matter without bruising either party. A measure of barley might change hands. A promise certainly would. The Anunnaki's law became a set of footsteps. The way a warden would walk the problem again at dawn to make sure it had not risen in the night did I end bad years. The city's intelligence shifted into common granaries. Loan remissions, calendar adjustments, sow later. Open the north sluice first, forgive the interest. Measure oil in smaller cups so hands do not feel deprived. In good years, excess learned to be modest. Oil jars were sealed too deep. Dates were dried on clean mats and strung. Barley was offered to temples not a spectacle but a strategy. Move gratitude through shared stores so that when lean arrives it finds a city with muscle already trained in sharing. There was science here, though nobody called it that word. There were salinity maps kept in heads, notched reeds that stood for water depth, trial plots that tried new spacings, seed jars that resembled time capsules. Farmers argued amiably about whether a furrow should be shallow this month or deep, whether a gate should blink open twice rather than stare once. They were astronomers of dirt and priests of water and scribes of root and stalk, their tablets the ground itself, red in cracks and colours and the way a footprint dried. The city tasted itself each evening in stew and bread. Onions sweetened the pot. Leeks greened it. Barley thickened it. Dates broke their caramel silence and melted into sauces. A bit of cheese made by someone who had listened to a goat all spring and learned when milk agrees with heat. A table was set low. A mat became a plate for talk. The day discovered it did not need to justify itself to be worth remembering. Children slept with the smell of chaff in their hair and dreamed of fields that rolled back their green sleeves to show the gold beneath. If water drew lines across the earth, fire drew lines through matter, teaching stones to flow, clays to harden, colours to deepen, and tools to hold an edge long enough for a field. A home, a temple to keep their promises. In Mesopotamia, flames were not spectacles to be fed with noise. They were instruments, tuned by bellows and watched by hands that had learned caution as a form of love. The Anunnaki, guardians of order, were present here as temperatures held, timings kept, and surfaces finished exactly so, nothing scorched, nothing raw. Everything brought to the point where usefulness becomes quiet beauty before dawn. A metalworker lifted the lid from a pit furnace and listened. Kilns and hearths speak in tones, coals murmuring, air whistling through a vent, the small click of cooling slag. He judged the night's rest by how the bricks returned his tap, by the way yesterday's ash took a print. A boy fetched charcoal in a woven pannier. A girl carried crucibles, fat-bellied, blackened from loyal service, and a bundle of tongs whose ends had been ground smooth so they would not bruise the work. Nearby, leather bellows waited like sleeping lungs, ready to feed the flame with measured breath. The workshop smelled of earth that had learned to shine. Copper did not come to the city by accident. It arrived as ore, green-streaked stone from mountains that the road knew like an old friend. Traders set ingots in the corner, their oxide shapes stacked like stored memories. The master set one on a flat stone and struck it with a hammer that had been struck by 100 other hammers. He listened for the note that told him how tired the metal was and how ready to move. Tools are not bullied here. They are persuaded. The flame was fed, the air was drawn, and the crucible swallowed or charcoal, and a measure of flux, clean sand, crushed limestone, things that know how to gather impurities and carry them away when copper first softens. There is a moment when workshop talk thins to a hush that is not fear but attention. A hand signals. Bellows fall into a steady cadence. Tongs lift the crucible just high enough to tip without splashing the sun across the floor. The metal moves like honey but brighter. It grows a skin and loses it. It accepts a channel carved in sand or a mold made by a careful week of clay work. The pour is the sentence. The cooling is the period. And then the patient part begins. Anneal. Hammer. Anneal. Hammer. Heat to relax the grain. Strike to persuade the shape. Heat again to tell the metal you remember it is not your servant but your partner. Bronze is copper brought into company. A little tin added so the whole becomes more than its parts. Tin came from far away. Its cost wrote itself into every line of the ledger. But a bronze adze, a bronze chisel, a bronze knife, these paid their passage with a song of usefulness that lasted for years. The Anunnaki were imagined smiling at this alloy not because it glittered, it rarely did for long, but because it held an edge without complaining and because it let carpenters cut cleaner joins, boat builders fit tighter seams, and masons trim stone with strokes that did not jar the elbow. A civilization is a chorus of small fatigue saved, and bronze saved much across the lane. A potter checked jars that had cooled in the night's generosity. He thumbed a rim, listening for a true ring. Clay had been wedged the day before, folded and pressed until they admitted defeat, and thrown on a wheel whose wobble had been argued out by a wedge under one leg. The wheel spun. The hands remembered, and remembering is the potter's real craft. Fingers rose with the wall, coaxing a cylinder into a jar into a belly into a lip that would pour without dribble. The pot's shoulder learned how to take a lid. Its floor learned how to sit on a stove ring without rocking. Inside, a few were slipped, washed with fine clay. A few were burnished with a smooth stone. A few were marked lightly at the hip with the potter sign, not for vanity, but so the workshop could trace a flaw and cure it in a future day. Kilns taught patience. A firing stack is a gathering. Biggest jars, then medium bowls, then lids, and cups tucked where heat lingers kindly. Combustion chambers primed with thin dry wood. Vents set so flame would lick but not bite. The firing rose like a sun you could not see, counted not by hours but by color. Straw, peach, dull cherry, bright cherry, each a temperature that a master's eye knew better than a number. The kiln was then closed as one closes a well-made sentence, not slammed, and left for the night to rehearse its lesson in quiet. If a pot exploded, it was not scolded. Somewhere a bubble had hidden or a shelf had warped. The ledger noted it. Hands adapted glaze, when used, was not a shout but a sheen, copper green obtained with care, a hint of yellow from iron's whisper. But most vessels kept the honest color of baked earth, sometimes darkened by reduction when the flame ate air and left the clay blushed with smoke. Good potters love both truth and trick, truth in form that sits well, trick in a slip that seals against oil. The Anunnaki were present as fitness, a jar that holds water cool because its clay breathes, a beer beaker whose lip tells the hand where to rest, a storage pot that fits a stopper so perfectly you could roll your seal on the binding strip with joy. Back in the metal shop, molds waited for repeated work, valve gates cut to lead metal into thighs of an ox ornament, into the arms of a lamp stand, into the short, strong stem of a chisel. Some molds were bivalve clay shells bound with cord. Others were carved stone that could be used again and again if treated gently. Others were lost wax, beeswax shaped, encased, melted out so the metal could take the hollow's memory. The casting trees cooled, were freed from their sand beds, were placed on a worn table for finishing, sprues cut, surfaces scraped, files drawn in strokes that whisper. The final touch, a burnish, taught light to skim the surface like a polite bird. Tools circulated like blessings. A plowshare arrived and left sharper. A sickle returned from harvest with a grin that needed evening. A needle broke and taught the smith a better angle. A hinge pin sang when tapped and thus promised to turn a gate without gall. Worn bronze was melted. Slag was crushed. Failures were recast. Nothing was wasted. The ledger's columns of copper in, bronze out were paired with the other ledger that lives in muscle. Strokes counted, heats remembered, tongues grasped where they will not scar. A city that knows how to repair needs fewer miracles. Fire made ornament, too, but even finery remembered its work. A pin held a cloak. A brooch spoke of a household. A thin sheet of beaten copper repousse worked with a reed punch became a shrine's gentle dazzle. A cylinder seal was drilled with patient grit, incised by a hand steadier than bragging, and polished until it rolled like water across wet clay. The images, king before God, barley sprig, star, were not random. They were abbreviations of vows. I will measure. I will share. I will keep the calendar that keeps me. Bellows turned the furnace into a metronome. 2 boys, later 2 men, Learn to squeeze and release until wrists could keep time even while eyes watch color. A coal's glow is a verb. A spark is a letter. The bar's red is a mood a master reads without panic. A mistake, too cold, and the metal cracks. Too hot, and it crumbles, is a teacher no one forgets. If an apprentice scorched a piece, the master did not shout. He led him to the refuse pit, split the creak of slag with a hammer to show the glassy layers, and spoke about boundaries, of air and fire, of patience and hurry. The carpenter visited often, smelling of cedar shavings and planed poplar. Together with the smith they married materials, bronze blade to wooden haft with a wedge that will tighten under use. Nails, rare, precious, where pegs cannot. A saw whose set teeth leave a clean line through hard wood. The potter, too, conferred, a bronze band around a jar's shoulder to catch a strap. A little copper spout set into a brewer's vat so a day's work pours clear. Trades met without pride, and the meeting produced longevity. Even the brickmaker's fire was a cousin to metalwork. Mud bricks sun-dried made walls. Fired bricks made thresholds, drains, and feet that did not drink the season's first rains. In the brick clamp, stacks were built with flues running like small streets. Fire walked them slowly, persuaded to visit every corner. When cooled, the master wrapped the faces and listened for truth. Fired brick remembers the Anunnaki as durability, corners that resist 1,000 steps, surfaces that stay honest under jars, thresholds that defer to years. In temple treasuries. Lists recorded tools as carefully as jewels. 3 chisels for stone, 2 chisels for wood, 1 adze, 1 bronze knife for offerings, 1 saw for beams, for tongs, 2 ladles for pourings, 6 needles for veils. There is devotion in such inventories, the recognition that worship fails if doors squeal, if lamp arms wobble, if veils tear. The assembly of the Anunnaki is reflected in the assembly of implements kept ready day to evening. The metal shop was banked, coal settled under ash to keep a seed of heat, tongs laid in their accustomed order, hammers hung with their heads consenting, files brushed and set dry, quench tub covered so dust would not find it in the night. The master wiped the bench with a damp cloth, not to shine it but to reset the surface to a tone where tomorrow's scratches would read clearly. He pressed his seal into a bit of clay, not to lock the door, locks were crude, but to lock his promise to begin again with care. If canals taught the city to move in measures and looms taught it to keep a steady hand, then music taught it to keep a steady heart. In Mesopotamia, sound was not a blaze to astonish. It was a line to follow, drawn by fingers over strings, by palms over skin, by air coaxed through reeds until breath learned the kindness of pattern. The Anunnaki, guardians of order, were felt here as meter made merciful, beats that did not bully, pauses that allowed the body to remember itself, melodies that rounded the corners of a day so it could lie down without chafing. At dusk, when courtyards cooled and lamps took their places like small stars, a musician, hair tied with a strip of woven cloth, hands washed of flour or clay, lifted a lyre. Its arms curved like the shoulders of someone listening. Its strings, gut, and patience twisted together, were tuned by ear against a little drone made by another instrument or by a boy humming a steady note. Tuning was a conversation with wood and air. A peg turned, the string crept toward the tone, a breath held, a tiny back-off, there, and the instrument nodded in its wooden way. No one hurried the tuning. It is a prayer to readiness. Beside the lyre sat a harp, larger and soft with years of touch. Its sound asked less of the skin, more of the room. A flute, dual-reeded, with a mild rasp like a good olive pressed against the tongue, waited its chance to draw a long line over the woven cushion of plucked strings. A drum, frame, or kettle, was warmed by coals until its head tightened to the right voice. The player tapped the rim and center, reading the drum's day the way a farmer reads wind. The sistrum, a rattle of metal tongues, spoke only on festival nights, and even then it spoke politely, a whisper of brightness that never tried to outshine the lamp. Music lived in rooms first. A mother leaned against a wall, knees up, a child's head in the corner of her lap. She sang the song of names, child's name, mother's name, father's name, the house's name, the streets, the cities, each syllable a knot in a rope thrown across the gap between worry and rest. She sang work songs while kneading, while carding, while sweeping. She sang counting songs that taught numbers to fingers and wheat to bowls. She sang balance songs, where one line asked and the next answered, so the mind could learn to end what it had begun. The Anunnaki were present as the permission to sing small. Temples kept a choir of voices and instruments that knew the shape of holy time. Hymns named the gods as if laying stones, one after another, with all the space necessary between. The lamentation priest, Gala, had a voice trained to fall like water through smooth channels. He kept a book of refrains in his head. Return, be gentle, remember, each sung on intervals the city had memorized without theory. On holy days, the harp rose first, offering a ladder of notes. And the voices walked it with bare feet, sure of where the rungs were because yesterday and last year they had been set in the same place. Markets had their music. More horizontal than vertical. A girl's sow cry rising and falling like a bird that knows the currents. A potter tapping rims in a quick sequence. Good, good, cracked, good. The percussive vernacular of quality. A weaver whistling a two-note loop that sits easily between warp and weft. A brewer thumping a vat's stave in fours to feel the ferment's answer. Bargaining itself learned to sing. Number spaced by little rests. Laughter on the upbeat. Agreement on the down. The scale's balance was a kind of cadence. Travel carried tunes in its saddlebags. Caravanists shared mouthed melodies at fires that threw shy light on donkeys' ears and sleeping ropes. A shepherd brought a pipe tune that sounded like ridgelines and windbreaks. A sailor kept a chant the or knew by instinct. A pilgrim's hymn tucked god names between breaths so one could walk and worship without tripping on either. When a song arrived from elsewhere, the city tried it on as a robe, altered a hem, loosened a sleeve, and made it its own without tearing the origin. There were poets, reciters with tablets in their minds, voices trained to turn long stories into gentle rivers. They unrolled epics in the same way a scribe unrolls a thought, line by line, with each end meeting the next beginning like stepping stones set in water. Even tales of heroes and their enemies, of cities and floods, of friends and long roads, were told without roaring. The cadence mattered more than the crash, regular, grave, courteous to breath. The Anunnaki, mentioned as assembly and measure, appeared as quiet judges within the poem, listening in the pauses to see whether the tale was aligning the world or merely exciting it. The audience, children heavy against their mothers. Men cross-legged with hands relaxed, followed the poet's meter like travelers counting moons. Notation, what later ages might call writing music, stayed mostly in the hand and the ear. But scribes kept lists of strings and tunings, of modes favored for laments or for festivals. A tablet that survived somewhere might have said, tune of the seventh, or for the goddess, the good mode, and a musician would know which strings to tighten, which to slacken. There were modes for repair, songs used when the temple plaster cracked and men climbed with baskets. Modes for washing statues. Modes for closing gates. Modes for easing the afterbirth when a midwife worked in a breath-counted room. Music lived where tasks lived. Children learned songs by doing them. A boy tapping a rhythm on a reed bucket learned that a pattern carried further than a fuss. A girl plucking two strings learned how a third string wanted to be found. The hand of the teacher was a steady metronome on a shoulder. Tap, 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 breathe, begin again. Errors were not crimes. They were leaks in a vessel, stopped by attention and a laugh. When the child's hands found the groove, the room felt it as a weather change, and work, carding, chopping, sorting, moved closer to joy. On festival nights, music walked the streets with the statue. Drum low, pipe soft, strings in pairs, the notes turned corners as if they had been taught manners. The sistrum's metal tongues awakened the door frames without startling them. A king's step learned humility from the drum. A priestess's voice learned patience from the harp's decay. The procession's chief music was the spacing of people. No crush, no lag, an embodied polyrhythm of feet, lamps, and breath. Kind order is audible, but there was also music for workbenches and keys. Rowers counted strokes muttered under the breath. Metalworkers matched bellows to 4 counts that made the fire neither sulk nor rage. Brickmakers sang a turning song as bricks were flipped to dry evenly. Threshers used a winnowing chant to throw and catch in time with wind. Spinners spun to a wheel hum that set twist into fibre at the same pace all morning. These songs kept sameness from souring and prevented haste from splintering a day. There were songs to end quarrels. A judge, done with the hearing, sometimes hummed a 2-phrase pattern while writing the last line of his decision. Without thinking, the disputants' voices lowered to the pattern. The quarrel's teeth retracted. In homes, a father tuned his words to the lullaby meter before speaking hard news. In markets, a steward recited weights on a pitch that everyone recognized as the key of fairness. Order had a timbre, grief had music that cleaned rather than scolded. Women led laments that dipped like swallows and rose like lamplight, weaving the lost name into the city's long refrain so it would not rattle outside the walls of memory. The lamentation priest brought modes that made space for tears and for the slow exhale that follows, without calling storms where drizzle would do. The Anunnaki, who know the underworld as a place of lists and gates and judges, were invoked as listeners who count every tear without asking them to be louder than they are. And there were the night musics, the softest, truest, many of them made by things that did not think of themselves as instruments, a door with hinges too well-oiled to complain, a rope humming slightly where it holds a roof, a dog exhaling in a courtyard, a date palm clicking now and then when its fronds settle. Families learned to lean into these sounds the way sailors lean into a familiar swell. Sleep is a rhythm, and the city practiced it together. If you listen now, you might find your own meter, not the drum of anxiety, not the trumpet of plans, but the lyre of breath, in for a count that feels kind, out for a count that feels kinder, a pause that does not fear its own stillness. Let your thoughts vibrate like strings tuned to a good drone. Let worries tap a rim and learn to rest. Imagine a harp in a cool room, a little oil lamp before it. A priest's voice naming the Anunnaki with so much space between the names that sleep can walk there. Unbumped, let the lullaby of the city take you, the oven's thup-hush. The canals talk against its bank, the step on a stair paused to avoid squeak. The hover of a note waiting to resolve and then resolving with no show at all. The world does not need to be loud to be clear. The gods do not need cymbals to hear you. A whisper on a good pitch carries farther than a shout thrown any which way. Tonight, you need only a song that fits your room. Close your eyes as a singer closes a line, complete, then quiet. Leave a little coda for morning, the way a musician leaves the last string just warm enough that tuning comes easy at dawn. The Anunnaki will keep the beat that you can't keep while sleeping. And when you wake, you may find that your hands remember the tempo of kind work all by themselves. If the fields taught Mesopotamia to welcome each morning, the underworld taught it to keep faith with each evening. In these lands, death was not imagined as a blaze or a cliff, but as a descent, a long stare into rooms where voices dim to a murmur and dust settles in polite layers. The place had many names: Carnegie, land of no return, the Great Below, and its queen, Ereshkigal, ruled with a stillness that asked for order rather than spectacle. The Anunnaki, so often pictured as the assembly of heaven and earth, sat here as judges, not to terrify but to reckon, balancing accounts the way a scribe balances grain, counting each act the way a weaver counts threads. The journey was told as a sequence, because sequences comfort. There were gates, 7 in some traditions, each with a keeper who asked nothing fancier than a proper greeting and a willingness to shed what cannot be carried below. At each gate, a traveller leaves a thing that once seemed indispensable: a clasp, a cord, a ring, a veil, a boast. To descend was to become exact again, the way a word becomes clearer when you rub its surface and the excess polish comes away. The Anunnaki who preside within these precincts were not imagined as flames. They were imagined as ledgers and lists, as measured glances that say, "We remember, and remembering will be our work." Above ground, families learned the grammar of farewell. They washed the body as they wash a room. They wrapped it in cloth that had already held sleep. They placed small things nearby that could be recognized even without sunlight: a cup, a pin, a little dog figurine. The place of laying was not a theatre. It was a niche in the continuum of living rooms and courtyards, or a small chamber appointed with the care one gives to a guest who may not return. The goal was not grandeur. The goal was continuity, that the dead should pass into a pattern that did not insult their days. Offerings had a name that sounded like footsteps. Kispu, the regular giving of food and drink to the departed. On new moons, when the night is thinner, families set out bread, beer, a little water, sometimes dates, and a few words remembered. The Anunnaki do not eat, and the dead do not drink as the living do, but the act is a bridge, a way for gratitude to cross the gap without shouting. It kept the departed within the circle of responsibility. Your name is said. Your portion is measured. We continue the habits that once made your hands sure did I in the cool of evening. A lamentation might rise, quiet, paced, designed to carry sorrow without tearing it. Women led it, because women already know how to hold a weight while doing other work. Phrases were repeated until they lost their sharpest edge, until pain could settle into a bearable shape. Names of gods were used as stepping stones. Anu, Enlil, Enki, each name a breath. Each breath a plank in a short bridge over the first deep hours. The lament did not ask for the world to be undone. It asked for companionship while it felt different. There were customs that made the living kind to the dead and the dead kind to the living. Doors were closed softly after dark so dreams would not be jostled. Water was not poured carelessly where it might run toward a resting place and disturb the dust. Harsh words were kept out of rooms where an ancestor's tablet, just a few lines pressed into clay, stood near a lamp. In some homes, a tiny shelf held shards from a cup that had once belonged to someone loved. The shards were not trash but evidence that care survives breakage. The Anunnaki of the underworld, less famous by name than their heavenly kin, were imagined as people who never forget what they have heard. A small kindness entered their book as surely as a small cruelty. Neither was swallowed by time. This is not a threat. It is a relief. It means the universe is competent at memory, and humans can rest from the impossible job of holding everything alone. Priests taught that a clear heart helps the ledgers to balance. Neighbors taught that a clear household, debt settled, promises kept, makes the crossing light. Stories gave models for returning, but they did not cheapen staying. Inanna's descent, told in rooms that knew labor and play alike, describe how even a goddess must obey the gates and how the world briefly forgets harvest and desire until she comes back, marked by what she has learned. The lesson was not that mortality can be beaten. It was that cycles are a kind of mercy. Down, then up. Dark, then light. Absence that teaches presence to behave better when it returns. Dreams were letter carriers between realms. A grandmother's caution might arrive in a dream with the smell of her baking. A father's patience might appear as a slow river. A lost friend might sit at the edge of a mat and say only, "It's enough," and the day following would know where to stop. The Ipu, healer priest, kept a small tablet of dream signs not to dominate sleep but to listen to it. A bird at the window means write the letter. A clean well means wait. A gate means ask permission before you push. The Anunnaki approved of such courtesy between worlds. Burial places were not banished to fear. They were neighbors. Paths to them were worn by feet that had also gone to markets and schools. A small tree learned the names leaned against its trunk in summer. Children were taught to speak softly then not because the dead are delicate, but because gratitude is, and gratitude needs calm air in which to turn around and face you properly. On festival days, when processions moved, trail dust sometimes hallowed these places as surely as incense did the temple. Judgment in the Great Below was not a drama for spectators. It was administration, questions asked carefully, weighed against a life's pattern. Did you keep measures honest? Did you share as you promised in the good year? Did you harm the helpless? The answers did not require rhetoric. They required recollection. Scribes taught that a person who keeps their ledgers in order here will be less frightened by ledgers there. This is a theology of habits, not heroics. When grief was very new, neighbors switched to smaller words. They brought bread and water and the little services that love invents, turning a jar so its handle meets the right hand, mending a fray at a mat edge, trimming a wick before it smokes. They did not force conversation across the fresh gap. They Saturday. The Anunnaki were thanked, not for taking, but for counting, for letting no good go unregistered, for letting no pain go unseen, for holding the continuity until the living could hold it again, and time did its patient work. Names were spoken less often but with clearer voices. A young couple borrowed a name for a child, not to trap the dead in the living, but to let the living carry a key that fits an old door. The house learned to place the cup on a different shelf. The city learned to set the errand through a different lane. The mat where a body once rested learned to hold empty air without sorrow spilling every time someone looked at it. There were also warnings the city kept as hedges against forgetting. Do not refuse kispu, elders said. Do not let the calendar of care rust. Do not cheat the scale, they said, because the Anunnaki's book is better kept than yours. Do not hoard your praise, they said, because the underworld has no lack of laments, but the living still hunger for good words said on time. These were not law codes alone. They were recipes for a society that can digest lost dot on certain nights. The moon rose like a clean bowl, emptied and ready to be filled, and the city felt lighter, as if some accounts had been settled. Lamps were lit in the niches where small tablets stood. A finger ran over the wedges like one runs over the carved lines of a familiar stair. We are still here, someone said softly, and the line answered itself. You are still here. The presence of the dead became a texture, not a weight. It accompanied. It did not dictate. That is what good memory does. It becomes useful like a tool, warm like a garment, steady like a wall that does not need to talk to be trusted if you are listening with your own names close tonight. Let the Mesopotamian underworld teach you the calm art of keeping. Set, in your mind, a small table, bread, water, a little sweetness. Say a name once, then again, slower. Let a gate open. Lay down a ring you do not need for the next hour, a habit, a hurry, a sharpness. Descend one stair, then another, only as far as comfort goes. Sit, just there, until breath tells you it is time to stand. When you return, bring back nothing but order, a promise to measure fairly tomorrow, to thank promptly, to speak softly where grief is working. The Anunnaki, who sit in many assemblies, will keep the ledger while you sleep. Your task is smaller and kinder, to allow forgetting to become rest, not neglect, to let remembering become companionship, not ache. Close your eyes as a gatekeeper closes a door, firm, respectful, without noise. The city is quiet. The judges are patient. The dust has settled properly. You may rest. Thank you for walking the quiet path through Mesopotamia's oldest stories, the Anunnaki seen not as fireworks, but as order made kind. Canals opened and closed on time. Loaves turned without burning. Ledgers closed without hurry. Songs ended with room for breath. If you felt your shoulders drop somewhere around the ziggurat stairs, or your pulse slow beside a lamplit tablet, that is the point. These tales were always lullabies wearing history's clothes, if you haven't already. You can subscribe so the next slow journey finds you right here, lamp-trimmed, pillow set. For now, let the assembly keep their watch, judges in their quiet hall, priests in their measured hymns, farmers in their sleeping fields, scribes with their last neat wedge cooling in clay. Your only task is to drift. The world is arranged enough for one night. Sleep well.